You wake before the bell and before the light, when the room is more breath than room, and the rafters keep the hush that belongs to frost. The wool blanket is stiff where your night air jeweled it. You lie still and let small things report the weather better than any mouth. The reed mat ticking under your heel, the timber's slow yawn, the spoon in yesterday's bowl settling to a colder rest. Nothing hurries. You borrow that pace and make it yours. You sit up and draw your coat close, the coarse weave rasping your wrists in a way you know to be a promise of warmth. Your breath gathers before your face and then crawls back through the scarf, obedient as a house cat that has decided you are tolerable. You move the hands first, the head last, and let the joints wake like old dogs without commands. Do little things neatly, you remind yourself, and the large things will allow it. Your feet find the boards, and the boards answer with a thin winter voice. You know where they complain and where they keep their counsel, and you place your steps accordingly. The boots by the door lie on their sides like two docile fish. You nudge them upright, pinch the leather at the heel where it stiffened in the night, and lace them as if you were lacing time. The iron latch is silly with cold. You blow on it, tap it with your knuckle, and the door relents. Outside, the yard insists on a blue you can taste. The world is made of quiet knives and mint. The shed wears whiskers of rime. The fence wires every post to the next with fine white thread. You press your palms together and breathe between them until the ache loosens. Down the slope, the river pretends to sleep. Little clicks, then long notes, pass through the skin of ice like gossip among careful neighbors. You walk, letting your boots write neat letters into the crusted path. The first light hovers among the birches, unwilling to admit itself yet. You nod to the stacked billets of alder, to the hoop of an old barrel winter kept out of respect for its stubborn circle, to the coil of hemp rope that will later be a sentence pulling something home. The gate knows your hand. Its hinge answers with a modest amen when you lift it just so. By the bank, the willows keep thin sleep, and the river bank wears a fringe of hoarfrost like old lace that remembers better feasts. You kneel and greet the ice with the back of your gloved knuckles. The river keeps its current under the lid the way a quiet man keeps his temper behind his teeth. This patch holds. That dull sparkle means tired sugar under the top. This gray-green asks for patience. You store the answers where your body keeps its maps. You take up the iron-tipped staff that leans where you left it yesterday. You lower the tip and give a gentle thump. The sound rises into your palm. Here is the sure drum of confidence. There, a reedy thrum that says, "Not now, friend." You arrange the replies in a simple row inside your head. You will mark them for others later. But first, you memorize the path the river wants you to choose. A plain truth walks beside you without ceremony. In deep, clean winters, these rivers, Vltava, Elbe, do freeze. And when they freeze, people treat the flat back like a road where boats once ruled. Wagons travel where oars flashed. Sledges slip along a white street. Errands move to a different floor of the world's house. Mainstream historical fact. In hard medieval winters, frozen channels served as seasonal roads for trade and daily life here in Bohemia. You permit yourself a harmless ritual, the kind that carries no weight but sits light in the pocket like a charm, quirky or fringe tidbit. Some villagers keep a bread crust or a little iron nail at the belt to feed or to pin the river spirit, so it will keep still. You carry a crust because your aunt swore by it and because it gives the mind something to do while the hands do the real work. You touch the pouch and feel foolish and comforted in equal measure. The balance suits you. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether the winters of the 12th century were reliably fierce enough to make an ice road every year, or whether freeze and thaw played capricious games from decade to decade. You leave that good debate to warm rooms and ink-stained patience. Your part is to listen to the present ice, which has its own opinion and speaks in a grammar you are slowly learning. One thump at a time. A jay complains from the willow. Smoke from the village lifts straight and narrow into the pail. If the wind will not trouble the smoke, perhaps it will not trouble you either. You flex your fingers inside the mittens, feel the ribs of the knit, rub palm to palm, until friction draws a thin thread of heat, and tuck that thread back into your sleeves. Wool on wool, a soft rasp, a small victory. The day asks for neatness, not bravado. So you perform neatness. You tuck the scarf so it makes a gate that keeps warm air home. You double the laces without pride. You angle your cap to bury your ears. You look back at the 2 clean rows of proof that you began, and then ahead to the work that waits without impatience. The blue deepens at the edges. A shy gold starts to pry at the rim of the world. You ask once more. The answer is sure enough to place the first willow twig. For now, you own the tools that are yours to own. Breath, wool, patience, the habit of slow attention, and the quiet humor that makes cold less proud. You let the river talk, and you let it finish. You breathe again into your hands, and watch the cloud rise and return like a homing bird. Today may be kind to crossings if a person minds his steps and does not argue. The ice clicks, the bank waits. You begin the day by standing still long enough to hear it. Inside again, you let the door lean shut against the cold, and press the latch until it decides to behave. The room keeps its own slow breath, a small mist of house scent that belongs to damp wool, smoke, and clay. You move by habit, not haste. 3 steps to the hearth, 1 to the water jar, another to the shelf where the clay pot waits with the familiar chip on its lip. You pour what you need and no more. Water gets argumentative when given an audience. The pot settles among the coals with a little scrape, as if clearing its throat before speaking sense. You fold today into simple tasks, the way a blanket folds around a sleeping child. Carefully, by corners first. You coax the coals with a sliver of kindling and a twist of last summer's grass. Fire returns like a neighbor who pretends he was never gone. Your hands hover over the glow until the ache softens and the fingers remember their manners. The soot on the hearth keeps that old moon color. The smell wood, clay, singed wool makes a thin, honest song that belongs to winter more than to you. Melee goes in. First, a cautious sprinkle, then a soft rain. The long spoon knows your thumb and settles under it as if bred for the job. You stir in slow circles. A pinch of salt, a nod of dried thyme, a smear of tallow along the rim, nothing grand, all useful. Steam lifts in pale folds. The surface burps once, politely, to say breakfast is underway, and the world may continue. You fetch the wooden bowl that remembers other mornings and rub its rim with the cloth that saw clean snow yesterday. The bowl sits near the fire to forget the night's chill. A small slice of yesterday's rye waits to float on top, not for show, only so the tongue finds company in the porridge. The knife asks for nothing more than a wipe on your apron and a promise not to vanish into the straw again. Modest bargains all honored, the pot speaks in thick syllables. You let the spoon stand upright like a staff, and you watch the steam draw little veils across the lip of the clay. The room approves without comment. Rooms are good at that. While the pot thinks, you tend to the feet, those moody animals at the ends of your legs. Boots are unlaced and peeled back with the care you give a stubborn onion. Leather holds the night like a grudge. It loosens when it smells fire. From the peg, you take the first wool strip, a long, patient ribbon meant to be wrapped, not worn alone. You test it with a knuckle. It passes. A whisper of tallow goes to the soles and heels. A village trick that keeps skin from splitting its opinions. Toes to heel, heel to ankle. The wrap lies flat, honest, obedient. Wrinkles become blisters, and blisters request attention at the worst times, so you decline them both. A second strip climbs higher, steady as a prayer said by a person who knows the words without fuss. The wraps slide into the boots. Leather, persuaded by warmth, forgives. Laces cross with the quiet that good work earns. You return to the hearth, stir again, and watch the porridge decide who it is. It reaches that proud moment when it will hold the spoon like a roadside sign, then relaxes when you add a sip of water. Good manners on both sides. You ladle a mound into the warmed bowl, crown it with rye, and watch a thin bead of tallow melt like a late, helpful thought. You eat without ceremony and without hurry. Each mouthful writes a line of heat down the throat and lays it in the belly where it can mind the store. A plain note for the day's ledger, mainstream historical fact. In medieval Central Europe, humble porridges, millet, barley, or oats were ordinary fare, boiled over open hearths in clay or iron pots, steady, filling, and indifferent to fashion. The statement carries no pride. It simply stands by the fire and is true. Your shoulders loosen their argument with the cold. Even the rafters creak as if satisfied. You allow yourself one small superstition, because superstition in winter is mostly a memory of caution dressed in older clothes. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some cooks here slip a pinch of salt to the hearth first, for the house spirit, before seasoning the pot, or tap the spoon against the lintel to teach it patience. No one defends such gestures loudly, but many keep them in private where they do no harm and occasionally tidy the mind. You oblige the old habit with a discreet tap and go on stirring. The ceiling, being a ceiling, offers no opinion. The porridge, being porridge, continues to thicken at its own calm pace. You smile at the way small nonsense keeps larger sense in order. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether, by the 12th century, village houses in Bohemia relied mostly on open central hearths, or whether early brick or tile stoves had already crept into common rooms alongside the old fire. The ground gives mixed answers: char and ash and smoke-blackened rafters in one place, broken stove tiles in another, and the dates refuse to stand in a tidy row. You let clever people keep that good quarrel under warmer roofs. Here today, your house keeps its heat where it always has, and the pot accepts its duty without needing to know what century thinks of it. You finish the bowl and scrape the last shy film from the sides, not because hunger demands it, but because waste feels careless in a season that forgives little. A splash from the jar rinses the bowl. The air will finish the job. The spoon goes back to its peg. The pot retires to the brick ledge to consider its successes. A narrow strip of linen winds around your calves to keep the trouser wool obedient. You lift the belt with its humble army, the short knife, the loop for the iron staff, the pouch with the ridiculous bread crust you carry anyway, 2 wooden pegs, a coil of yarn, 1 iron nail, because nails settle arguments that rope alone cannot. Outside, the light understands its assignment at last and finds its way through frost on the little window. You tug the door. The day answers like a well-trained dog, ready, quiet, not showy. Boots acknowledge the raps with a well-mannered lack of complaint. Your breath meets the morning again. The river waits below, playing its low music under the lid. Breakfast sits inside you and turns the cold into something you can afford. You take the iron-tipped staff from the peg by the door the way you take a thought you did not finish yesterday. It fits your palm because your palm has taught it how. The wood is ash, straight as a rule. The ferrule at its foot nicked and honest. You carry it like a third leg that knows the path and disapproves of hurry. The slope to the river is the same slope as always, only today it wears the fragile armor winter prefers. Your boots hush the crust, then break it, then hush it again. A small conversation between soul and snow that needs no witness. At the bank you pause until your breath loses its theater and becomes simply air with a task. The surface is a single sheet of paused motion, dull where the night gnawed, clearer where the current slowed and waited. You do not step first, you ask. You set the tip of the staff on the edge and press exactly as much as courtesy allows. The ice answers with a sound you feel more than hear, a drum the size of your bones. You note the willow root, the darker ribbon that never quite sleeps, the small snow dunes that caught the wind and can hide a young crack. Your first thump is a greeting, the second a question, the third the one that matters. You give it a little more wrist, not a challenge, only a truth test you have performed 100 times, and will perform another 100 if luck and care remain friends. The sound returns with a weight of confidence, not hollow, not brittle. A note you would pour into a cup if you could. You ease your weight onto the near edge and keep the other foot at the bank, as if you were still partly a land creature and only visiting this new floor. You remember last week's powder and the day of wind that swept it. Under that memory lives the map you trust. Drift here, glare there, a seam where the mill race sneaks near. You set the staff astride ahead and thump again. The sound travels down the shaft and through your arm as a small sermon on patience. You do not argue with sermons you can use. You mark the spot with your heel and advance a measure, the staff once more becoming the mouth of the river and your arm the ear. By the second bend, a thin lace crack shows a private distance between 2 plates. It looks harmless, like a hair laid on glass, but hairs have pulled down heavier things than themselves. You set the ferrule beside the line and press. The ice replies with a whisper and a sulk. You step back without drama and angle left, letting the staff ask for you. The tip finds a place that rings like a loaf tapped from the oven. You smile without telling your face and place your weight there. A few more steps make a sentence you will trust later with a load. You stop and draw a willow twig from your belt. The bark is cold and smooth, and the knife lifts a small bark tongue that will catch the light. You twist the twig into a fissure and leave it there, a short green word that says, "This way held." You have a pocket full of such words, and you will spend them as the morning grows. What is a road but a set of agreements the ground keeps for a while? You nod to your own thrift and settle the scarf around your neck so it stops trying to become a banner. Mainstream historical fact. People in medieval Central Europe used poles and staves to test and cross winter ice, tapping and listening, prodding for weak spots, and often following known fords as the safest lines. It is not a dramatic truth, which is why it works. The day admires plain tools used plainly, and the river respects a careful question more than a loud claim. The river speaks again, in a long, low voice that runs under your feet, like a loom drawn through its first pass of the day. Somewhere beneath, the current still thinks in liquid grammar. The ice on top translates, not perfectly, but well enough to keep a person honest. You kneel and brush away a veil of horror to find the ice itself. Under the sugar, the color deepens to a blue-green the sky forgot. You measure with your eye, with the memory of your father's hand beside yours long ago, with the blunt arithmetic that winter allows. You count in the quiet language of the season. A thumb's width of clear ice will tease and break. A hand's breadth will carry a walking person who minds their steps. More will carry a small sledge if the day keeps its promise. You are not a sledge yet. You are a person with a staff and an ordinary wish to arrive. You let that ordinariness keep you polite with the river. Polite walkers leave fewer stories for others to tell on their behalf. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some here claim the river offers 3 kinds of music in hard frost: anvil, harp, and flute. Anvil is trustworthy. Harp is poetic and unreliable. Flute is pretty and hungry and would like you closer. You have heard all 3, or believe you have, which amounts to the same behavior. Today's notes lean toward anvil, with a little boasting of harp, where the mill run worries the edge. You keep your distance from music you cannot spend. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how formal the practices of winter crossing were in the 12th century here, whether towns kept written rules for ice roads and tolls, or whether knowledge lived mostly in the habits of those who walked rivers more than roads, when the sky asked them to. The charters talk of fords in summer and ferries in spring. The season of ice rarely puts its procedures in ink. You walk between ink and memory, and let the staff sign for you with each measured thump. Wind noses along the bank and changes nothing. The sun cautiously pushes a blade through the cloud and sharpens shadows against the pale. On mornings like this, the river allows sense to look like boldness to anyone watching from a warm doorway. You know better. Sense is smaller and quieter. It begins with a pole, a thump, a note, a decision, and continues until the far bank finds your boots and says nothing about heroics. You oblige the day by being the unremarkable person it requires. You lay 3 more twigs to finish a curve around the treacherous place, near the drowned alder. Then, you retreat along your own marks to test the path again, like a tailor turning a seam inside out to see if it lies flat. The notes you hear now are the notes you want. Full, unshowy, willing to carry dull errands and ordinary people. Dull errands and ordinary people are exactly what winter hopes to see. You do not make winter jealous with flourish, you satisfy it with neatness. You draw your breath like thread through cloth. Smooth, even unexciting. The staff stands in the snow a moment as if it were a marker placed by someone earlier and wiser. You laugh once under your scarf at the joke of being both earlier and later than yourself, then pick it up and let it lead. Each thump writes a careful word in a language that will melt at noon and be written again tomorrow. You are content to be literate just long enough for today's crossings, and then you will gladly forget until morning asks the same questions again. You draw 7 willow twigs from your belt and sort them by feel. Each is the length of your hand, peeled to a pale tongue so the weak sun can find it. You stand on the bank where snow turns to glass and let your breath become steady enough to be useful. The first move is listening. The staff asks for you. Tap, tap, thump. The sound returns full and even. You lower your weight onto the ice as onto a stair that might complain if rushed. The bank releases you with its practiced winter sigh. Your first twig slides into a narrow seam and stands upright, angled just a whisper toward the safe line. A modest flag for people who believe in questions before steps. You advance the space of one careful stride. Between two markers, a road begins, even if the road lives only in your head for a moment. You sight along the faint green under the clear surface, where the current slows and strength gathers. The staff asks again. The note is good. You plant the second twig. The distance pleases you. Far enough for a sledge to pass, close enough that a tired walker will never be abandoned to his own guesses. You press both twigs deeper with the ferrule until they argue no more. A crow shouts from the drowned willow as if hired to criticize. You answer by not offering him the audience he wants. You set the third twig where the river widens, and the sun brightens the peeled notch so it winks like plain advice. The bank can be treacherous where it looks friendly, so you lean the marker a degree toward midstream. Powder skitters. You brush it aside with the back of your glove and keep the glass readable. You kneel, scrape away a breath of frost bloom, and recheck the color. The ice shows sober green-blue, not the sullen milk that has ruined better boots than yours. Tap, tap, thump. The response is the anvil note. Not clever, simply true. You plant the fourth twig and refuse to feed the pride that rises for a moment. Pride trips, neatness walks. You tie your scarf a little tighter and move on. Mainstream historical fact. In winter across medieval Central Europe, people marked fords and ice roads with brush, stakes, or cut branches so carts, sledges, and walkers could follow a tested line rather than guess with each step. The habit turns a season into instructions. You write those instructions today in short, honest strokes. Where the millrace shadow worries the main channel, you bend the path with two careful choices. The fifth twig stands nearer the note you trust. The sixth holds the curve so it will not unravel. You listen for the faint harp tone that hints at livelier water below. When you hear it, you step back and keep your distance. The crow grows bored with disaster that refuses to happen and goes elsewhere to prophesy. You keep a private code you never insisted others adopt. Quirky or fringe tidbit. A forward slant means confidence. A backward slant means respect. A dead straight spear means pause and ask again, especially with a load. The river does not read angles. Neighbors do. Jan steers wide at a backward tilt. Your cousin adds a second thump at a straight one. A code is useful if it invites care and costs nothing. A healed crack crosses your proposed line with the quiet of a scar. You put two twigs close together, like a pair of old men murmuring about weather. Between them your ferrule presses, and the note comes back honest but tired. You promise to keep loads light there, and to say something later if the sun grows bold. The seventh and eighth markers go into thicker, deeper color, where the undervoice is confident again. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether 12th century villages here appointed formal wardens to maintain crossings, named people with duties, and small tolls, or whether the work flowed informally to whoever had the knowledge and the need. Records are quiet, stories are loud. You accept the ordinary truth. Today you are the warden because you are here, and tomorrow it will be someone else with the same patience. You test your own sentence by walking back along it, as if you were a stranger. From this angle the line reads the way you hoped. A calm curve around the mill's mischief. A reasonable straight. A tidy approach to the far bank where drift hides slush under an innocent face. You add a ninth marker near that drift and kick aside a deceptive pillow of snow so nobody is lured into softness. The staff asks once more. The answer is anvil again. Good. A whistle carries from the opposite shore, two short, one long. You raise your arm and let it fold. Your neighbor appears with a coil of rope and a sledge runner tucked under his arm. He tries the first twig like a man testing a chair. It holds. He moves to the second. His staff finds the same note yours did. At the close pair, he slows, nods, and skirts the scar as instructed. You feel the warmth of seeing another mind follow your handwriting on the river. You plant the 10th and 11th markers to finish the exit, then climb the far bank and look back. The river wears a row of modest flags. They do not boast. They simply explain where today's sense lives. Powder drifts and softens the scene, but your peeled tongues still catch the light. This road will stand for a day, maybe two, and then it will be rewritten by someone else in the same plain script. On your return, you spare one last twig for the place where people hurry near the landing where gossip gathers and attention loosens. You set it straight, because straight slows talk better than any sermon. The crow returns and pretends he never left. You refuse him again the applause he craves. You step off the ice with the small ceremony of a person moving from one element to another. Snow creaks differently on ground than on river. You hear the difference and accept the change. Behind you, the markers do their work without pride. Ahead, the slope up to the yard waits for ash and broom. The morning enlarges, but it does not hurry. You match it, and are content to have written a quiet sentence across a moving thing that consented, for now, to hold still. You climb the slope to the yard and fetch the ash bucket the way one collects a thought that has been cooling all night. The pail lives under the eaves where sparks fear to roam. Its wooden handle gives a winter squeak and then cooperates. You lift the lid and the smell rises old fire, a dusty sweetness like sleep in a warm sleeve. The ash is pale as paper and fine as apology. You have learned to move it as you would an elder, gently, without sudden gestures that raise a fuss. On the bench waits the sieve, a hoop of willow with a bottom of woven reed. You knock it once to scold out last week's stubborn clumps. The ash goes in. You rock the hoop with a rhythm that remembers grain winnowing after harvest, and the fine passes through while the coarse sulks on top. Little black stars char that never learned its lesson stay behind. You tip them into a separate bowl for later, because nothing is useless in winter if it will hold a spark. Beside the ash sits a sack of chaff, the cheerful litter left from threshing, a memory of busy summer flails now turned to quiet winter service. You plunge a hand and feel the lightness that mocks heaviness. Chaff carries the smell of dry sunlight, even now, and your mind thanks it for the favor. You mix a measure into the ash with a wooden spoon, and the two together become a powder that pretends to be harmless, until someone slips, then it remembers its real calling, and gives a small grip to the foot and the runner. Down at the landing, where snow has grown polished by the worship of many boots, a shine waits like a sly grin. You test with your palm, and your palm scolds you for being a fool. You keep your feet where the crust still holds its dignity, and you lift the sieve. From the gate to the first willow you sift in a slow rain. The rim taps your wrist each time you swing, and the path receives a gray veil that turns glare into sense. You do not aim for beauty. You aim for ordinary safety, which is lovelier than beauty when people are carrying things that must not be dropped. The staff helps with the parts your back refuses to honor. You plant it, lean, and sift again. The ash settles into the tiny scales the cold raised on the snow's skin. Chaff rides down and catches there like polite burrs. A hen would be pleased to scratch in such tidiness. You work a fan of powder on the slope where the sledge always tries to run ahead of the rope. The rope will still try, because it has ambitions beyond its station. But ambition slides less when ash and chaff politely disagree with it. Mainstream historical fact. In medieval winters, people scattered ash, straw, or chaff on slick approaches yard paths, threshold steps, river landings to give feet and sled runners honest purchase when frost turned the world into a sheet of sly intentions. The habit is not noble, but it is faithful, and faithful habits keep ankles where ankles belong. At the corner where gossip gathers, you press the sieve close to the ground and pour a thicker stripe. That corner eats concentration. People pass it with their mouths working and their eyes wandering, and the ground listens for its chance. The ash gives them back a margin of attention they tried to lend to talk. You tamp the powder with the flat of the staff, and it darkens a shade, as if pleased to be taken seriously at last. Quirky or fringe tidbit. A few here say the first pinch of ash must be tossed over the left shoulder to blind the winter's eye, and that if you forget, the river will notice and place its hand under your heel at the worst time. You humor the custom, because it takes nothing from you, and because the motion itself, small, private, foolish, drains pride from your wrists. Pride and ice are cousins. Both enjoy a fall. The sledge runners like the mixture, more than they admit. You pull the empty sledge down the treated strip and feel the change. The faint rasp that means wood and winter have agreed to shake hands. On bare glare the sledge tutors you with arrogance. On ash and chaff it minds its manners, and glides without lunging for the door like a dog that thinks it owns the street. You nod to the invisible committee of materials and carry on. You scatter a path to the rescue pole too, because rescue works best when people can arrive standing upright. The pole waits where you left it, the hemp loop coiled like a snake that has chosen virtue. You dust its base and the approach to it, then the little shelf where a pan of coals sometimes sits for thawing straps. Every winter builds an arrangement like this. Every winter pretends it invented it. You accept the pretense and do what has always been done. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how systematically such winter measures were organized in 12th century villages, whether a reeve or sworn neighbor managed the scattering of ash and straw, or whether each household tended its few rods of path, and the river landing as an unspoken obligation. Records praise big deeds and forget small ones. The ground remembers all of them and keeps score without ink. Wind noses along the bend and lifts a little ash into a soft ghost that floats a moment and then agrees to land. You turn your back to shield the sieve and take the hint to work low and deliberate. Where the slope steepens, you fetch the broom, a bundle of birch twigs bound with stubborn thread, and you brush the ash in cross-hatched strokes. It seems fussy until a boot prints there and does not slide. Then it seems like common sense dressed as embroidery. You save a double handful for the steps at your own threshold, because the door plays tricks when your arms are full of wood later. 2 shakes, and the risers lose their treachery. You thump them with the staff for good measure, the same polite interrogation you gave the river. Everything wants to be asked a question if it is expected to carry you. On the way back to the landing, you pass the old alder stump that keeps trying to be a chair. You dust the ground around it too, because waiting is one of winter's trades, and waiting prefers not to bruise itself. A child trots up with bone skates slung over one shoulder, eyes bright as if the sun were hiding inside them. You point at the ash and chaff and say nothing. The path speaks for you. He nods, sets his skates near the safe line, and obeys the quiet invitation to cleverness without risk. You finish by stepping off your own track and looking at it as if it weren't yours. From the gate to the willow, from the willow to the landing, from the landing to the rescue pole and back to the house, the ground has been instructed in a language it understands. Light gray on white, a slim margin where feet can trust themselves. The job pleases you because it attracts no attention and nevertheless keeps people upright and loads intact. You set the sieve on its hook and clap your gloves together once, not for applause, only to dismiss the lingering dust that wanted to follow you inside. The ash bucket returns to its corner, and the chaff sack receives its tie. The bench coughs out a puff of pail when you slap it, and then it too settles, like a good friend who decides to stop speaking. You glance at the sky still high and colorless, and at the river still pretending to be a docile road, and let your breath out slowly, as if paying a small debt in correct coin. The day has many more errands, but this one will make the rest simpler. And simpler is the nearest thing to mercy winter regularly offers. You fetch the sledge from the shed wall where it waits like a patient insect, legs tucked, purpose folded. The boards have taken on the same winter hush as the fence posts and the lintel. You set the runners up on a plank so you can speak to them without bowing your whole back to the cold. Wood explains itself with grain and sheen. You listen the way you listen to the river, only closer. Your palm travels the length of each runner and comes away with a small report. Here, a roughness that wants a word. There, a shallow scar from last week's careless stone. Farther on, a place that feels tired and dry. You nod as if the wood has given a confession you were already prepared to forgive. You draw the short scraper from your coat pocket and let the blade whisper, not biting, only shaving away the little arrogance the wood learned yesterday. A drift of pale curls collects on the plank, like winter's handwriting. You brush them aside with the back of your glove and feel again. The runner answers with a quiet you can use. Where the grain rises, you stroke along it, not across. The same courtesy you give a horse's coat. The board smooths itself under your patience until the light runs along it in one unbroken line. From the shelf you take the clay cup of tallow you rendered when the weather first turned. It smells faintly of kitchen and of the patient beast that once pulled a plow and now keeps people warm. It is the color of unlit candles and the weight of a modest promise. You warm the cup on a flat brick by the embers until the surface softens to a friendly gloss. Outside again, you work with mitten off, mitten on, mitten off, because skin knows more than wool and yet dislikes knowing it for long. A thin smear on a cloth becomes a tongue of kindness on the runner. You rub until the dull place remembers it can shine without boasting. At the curve where the nose of the runner turns up, you press 2 fingers and feel the wood consider your suggestion. It accepts. Along the inside edge where frost likes to grow a fine saw of ice, you lay a more careful line. Peace there too. You step back, squat to the angle that shows truth, and let your eyes travel from heel to tip. No snag, no shiver. Work done correctly needs no witness beyond silence. You say nothing and reach for the rope. You lift the coil the way you would lift a sleeping cat under, and gathered, with respect for tangles that wake quickly and loudly. Hemp says little, but if you put your ear to the coil, you can hear its breath. Each twist remembers the field it grew in, the redding pond that taught it humility. The lay the rope maker walked backward into the fibers as he sang to keep his steps even. You pay it the courtesy of a clean start. One end found, smooth, and asked its name again. The other end stays folded in the coil like a promise you intend to keep. Knots prefer calm hands. You give them calm hands. A simple loop greets the sledge crossbar. A careful tuck follows, the sort that will not slip even if the rope decides to rehearse its tricks. You lean back until your boots whisper on the ash you scattered earlier. The rope answers with a steady quiet you can put in your pocket. You test again because testing is cheaper than mending, and because the day has not yet scolded you for doing a task twice. Mainstream historical fact. Hemp rope served common work across medieval Central Europe, strong when dry, honest when damp in wooden sledges, greased with fat or oil, moved firewood, grain, and people when wheels sulked in drifts. The truth is plain, older than ink, and perfectly suited to errands that do not need to be admired to be necessary. The crossbar complains at a small split you've been ignoring. You listen as if it were a neighbor with a grievance and give it a thin wedge. The back of your knife persuades the wedge home. A peg follows, cut from the same willow you used for river markers, seated with the ferrule of your staff because the ferrule is already there, and knows how to be persuasive without breaking anything. The frame settles the way a horse settles when its girth sits right. You praise it with silence and with one palm pressed flat to the board, until the cold and the wood agree to share your hand. You walk the runners with the cloth again, adding the quietest breath of tallow to the places that will kiss ash and chaff. Where the grain had lifted at the bend, you rub longer. The lifted place lies down like hair smoothed with water. Your body learns the sledge the way your body learned the curve in the ford. Each useful thing in winter has a map and a temperament. If you memorize both, errands become shorter than stories. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some here whisper their errand once into the rope coil before setting out, believing the rope tangles less when it knows where it is going. Others rub a clove of garlic along the first arm's length to keep mice and mischief away. You indulge the whisper and skip the garlic not from disbelief, only because breakfast already tells enough stories, and you do not need another scent following you. You draw the sledge onto the treated strip by the gate and let it taste the world. The runners find the ash and chaff and make the soft rasp you hoped for. Not the shriek of dry wood, not the foolish slick of overgreased pride, just the steady murmur of work admitting itself. You walk backward, rope over one shoulder, staff in the other hand for gossip and counsel. The sledge follows like a reasonable friend, half a pace behind, not stepping on your heel, not lunging toward the doorway, as a dog will when it sees its own idea of home. At the corner by the willow stump, you rehearse the turn you will make later, under weight. The rope slides on your shoulder. You switch shoulders. The staff taps the ice's grammar before each step. You feel the small drag at the narrow seam, and the brief urge to pull sideways where the mill race sulks. These are not disasters. They are phrases in the day's language, and you learn them until you can say them without thinking. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how often peasant sledges in this region wore iron shoes or nail strips along their runners in the 12th century. whether such fittings were common beyond towns and monasteries, or whether plain wood carried most burdens while metal waited for richer errands. The ground keeps its secrets, the ledgers keep theirs. A few orphan fittings do not tell you how ordinary days were done. Your sledge is wood today because wood you have, and wood will do. You study the rope again, because looking twice is a courteous habit. You find the place where an old knot kinked the lay and work it smooth with thumb and patience. You think of the rope maker's backward walk, of the little spindle that added twist, of the way fresh hemp smells like a clean cupboard near a stream. You think of the way cold stiffens fibers, and how one warm breath will coax them to lie flatter around the crossbar. You grant the breath, and keep your face from touching metal, because faces and iron argue in winter, and the iron always wins. At the landing, you practice with nothing on the deck, not because you doubt the sledge, but because rehearsal under light burdens makes real work immune to surprise. You follow your own twig-marked sentence curve by the healed crack, straight over the honest note, patient near the mill's shadow, and you arrive at the far bank as if guided by a handwriting you recognize. You meet yourself there, approve the choices that person made, and return along the same line to see if the river will say the same words twice. It does. You pause at the rescue pole and check the loop for stiffness, the knot for pride, the pole for splinters that would scold hands already busy with other troubles. You dust a little ash where your boots will have to stand and pull. You set the sledge aside and let your arms hang until your shoulders admit they belong to you again. The river hums. The village coughs. Somewhere a dog gives a winter bark that sounds like wood knocking on wood. None of it demands a reply. Back at the yard, you lay the rope in a proper coil on the deck guy in the middle, free end on top. No cross is hungry for future tangles. You pinch the last turn under itself, and it behaves like a trained hen. A light wool cloth goes over the runners to keep stray grit from arguing with tallow. You sit on the stool and tie your mittens tighter at the wrist with a twist of yarn, because mittens wandering into sleeves are winter's favorite joke. You test the pull once more on the short strip you dressed at the threshold. It gives the same soft rasp, the same faithful slide, the same promise that if you do your part, it will do its part, and the two of you will embarrass no one today. You set your hand on the crossbar and bow your head for a half breath, not a prayer exactly, only a small contract between materials and intentions. Then you lift the rope, set the staff under your arm, and let the path to the woodpile begin to write itself in neat, ordinary lines. You go to the woodstack the way a person goes to a cupboard with old, reliable bread in it without ceremony, with a mild trust that the thing you need will be there and behaving. The pile leans against the fence where the north wind forgets to show off. Birch and alder wait with their winter freckles on, bark lifting in thin curls that remember last summer's sap. Your glove rubs around where frost wrote its name on a split face. The frost erases itself under your touch, and nobody complains. You crouch and choose by feel rather than pride. Pieces dry enough to ring when kissed together. Not so fat they bully the sledge, not so thin they waste the rope's attention. A knot here for cheerful long burning, a straight split there for honest quick heat, small parliament, quiet votes. You set the sledge's nose into the ash you laid earlier, as if introducing two modest friends who have already heard of one another. The runners answer with a content rasp. Rope comes forward over your shoulder. The staff tucks under your arm. The day makes room. Two billets go lengthwise across the deck to make a sensible floor that will not teach the rest of the load bad habits. Three crosswise, three more, and the stack begins to look like a tidy argument, each piece disagreeing in the way that keeps the whole from wobbling. You lift with knees, not with complaints. Wood is heavier when it hears boasting. You keep your voice dull and your back grateful. Knots prefer calm hands. You give them calm hands. A half hitch greets the crossbar. The rope slithers around the stack, tucks, and comes home to itself, as if it had planned the path all along, and was only humoring you by pretending to be guided. You lean back, and the load settles with a small cluck from somewhere inside it. The sound of wood deciding not to be dramatic. The deck lowers the width of a finger. The runners do not object. You give the rope a second turn, and tuck the tail where it cannot practice mischief. The coil at your belt keeps one spare loop, in case the river asks you for an extra sentence later. Before your first step, you listen, because listening has paid you better than courage ever did. The river keeps its iron song under the pale crust. A steady anvil note with a fine harp thread near the mill race. Just enough music to flatter patience. Your willow markers stand like quiet men at a parish boundary. Not officious, just present. You put your boot on the turned earth, where ash and chaff have made decent ground out of the world's vanity. The sledge tips its hat by moving when asked, and not before. Down the slope, the rope over your shoulder becomes a line in a copybook. Smooth, even, a lesson you remember from yesterday. The deck whispers, the runners kiss the ash. At the bank, you halt and give the staff its office. Tap, tap, thump. The note returns the same size as your bones. You advance a foot at a time until your boot writes a first sentence on the white. The sledge supplies polite punctuation. Behind you, the fence and the yard retreat without feelings. Halfway to the curve, you let the rope slide, switch shoulders, and lean slightly to tease the nose around the healed crack that keeps a grudge. The twigs you set earlier nod, as if impressed by your obedience to your own handwriting. The sledge bumps once, not twice, and falls back into manners. You feel the weight choose its seat again. The ice, which hates surprises, accepts the apology. Mainstream historical fact. In hard winters, across medieval Bohemia and its neighbors, firewood traveled by sledge over snow and frozen water. The season making a road where in summer the river was a road of a different sort. Villagers moved alder, birch, beech, and brush in this quiet way, saving wheels for months that forgave them, saving grease for places that answered to it. The practice is not noble. It is simply how work crosses a landscape when the landscape decides to help. Where the curved stakes of last year's bundle still show under drift, you pause and test your knots. The rope, flattered by attention, behaves. You nudge the leading billet with your glove so its corner points the way a willing animal points its ears. Small changes guide heavy loads. Winter tells this joke daily and never tires of it. You step again. The sound under your feet deepens where the current is slow, brightens a shade where the mill race fusses. You give both their due and keep your eyes near your toes, where usefulness lives. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some here spit very formally on the first log laid at day's fire. So the house eats before the river does, as if smoke had a stomach and rivers had appetites. Others tuck one chip in a pocket for kindling of the mind, which would be grand if minds were stoves and not mules. You allow yourself the harmless flip of a chip into your pouch, mostly because your aunt will ask later if you remembered, and saying yes is warmer than the argument that would follow. At the broad straight, you let your gaze walk to the far bank, and then haul your attention back to the next 5 steps, which is where all useful things happen. You aim your nose where you intend to be, your feet where you actually must place them, and you let the sledge understand the difference. The rope hums against your coat like a modest fiddle that respects the tune. A crow throws a comment from the alder. You permit it the profession of criticism, while you continue the profession of not falling. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether common folk here in the 12th century held firm customary rights to gather deadfall and cut brush from lordly woods without fee, or whether those later, sterner forest customs were already busy reining in small hands with large punishments. Charters make proud promises. Customs make ordinary days. You, being neither a charter nor an argument, bring home what winter allows and trust everyone to continue pretending this is reasonable. Near the mill's shadow, the river tries a flute note to see if you will admire it. You refuse admiration and answer with angle and patience. The staff tastes ahead. Your shoulders lean just enough. The runners flirt with the thought of sliding sideways, and then decide they were only teasing. The rope warms under your palm, where you break a breath longer than you planned. The willow markers look on as if they, too, have learned to keep their expressions. The far bank rises as slowly as a shy guest. The landing keeps the ash you dressed it with, the mixture darkening under the ferrule's tap, as if pleased to be useful twice in one morning. You give the rope a final, courteous pull and feel the load climb to honest earth. The sledge makes that low wooden sigh that says both of you are allowed to stand straight now. You do, and the blood returns to your fingers with pins that pretend to be needles and will be friends again in a minute. You do not unload in a heap like a hero who wants witnesses. You set each billet where a future you will find it without cursing the past. Cross, 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 then 2 lengthwise to end the course, a stack that sheds wet and mines gravity. You tuck a sliver of bark under the lowest layer because wood likes to breathe even when it says it does not. One wedge goes under a heel that wanted to learn rolling. It stops wanting. The rope unknots without sulking. You coil it as if the rope maker were watching. You look back across the ice and see your little procession. 2 neat lines of boot prints, a soft braid of runner marks, and the modest smiles of peeled willow. No drama in it, which is almost praise. You take the empty sledge by its snout and feel how lightness can misbehave. You shorten the rope so it cannot run ahead and shame you at the corner. The return is always quicker, and quickness is winter's trickiest gift. You accept it and keep your footfalls spelled correctly. On the near bank, the yard lifts its shoulders like a friend ready to help with the next load. You will take another stack before noon, if the sky minds its job and the river keeps its temper. For now you set aside a billet for the hearth, one with a graceful knot because fire, like people, enjoys a story that does not try too hard. You let your breath leave you in a long script that fades above the sledge. Then you touch the staff to the bank, tap, tap, thump as if saying thank you in a language both of you understand. And the day nods without wasting words. The river has its own voice this morning, an anvil hum with a thin harp edge near the mill's shadow, but a sharper sound needles in from the far bank. 2 short whistles, 1 long. It is not a bird. Birds have opinions. This is a message. You turn your head without turning your shoulders, because ice likes people who remember to be considerate. A pair of figures stand beyond the willow drift, one with a coil of rope at his hip, the other with a staff like yours. Both raise their arms in the broad, friendly geometry that means we are watching the same thing and prefer you not to step where the river becomes proud of itself. You answer with your own small grammar. Your staff goes up, horizontal, slow wait. Then you tip the ferrule toward the path you marked at dawn, a quiet refusal of any temptation to shortcut the curve near the healed crack. Across the water, the nearer man shapes his hand into a shadow visor and leans into it as if vision were a job paid by the hour. His whistle repeats 2 short, 1 long, and he points downstream to where a ribbon of blue-green under the crust promises a better bearing. You follow his finger until it meets your memory. The places agree. Good. You move 3 steps along your markers, so you share a line of sight. The ice under you speaks its confident anvil note. The staff approves. The birch behind you keeps a thin drift of poetry in its branches and declines to shed it. You put 2 fingers to your lips and return 1 brief whistle polite acknowledgement. Not a conversation. Sound behaves as if the air were ironed this morning. The note crosses the channel like a smooth bead on a wire. Cold flattens noise into usefulness. Gossip has to wait until thaw. The figure with the rope makes a circle with his arm. Bring. You shake your head, then demonstrate the same circle smaller. Not yet. Lighten first. He understands and shrugs, which is the international winter gesture for, I wanted to argue but my coat has the better of me. You point with the staff to the safer line that holds to the shallow, then plant the ferrule and thump. He hears it, reads your shoulder, and nods. Across the white, the 2 men angle their sledge to catch your path where you planted the 9th twig earlier. The twig is small, but the memory you wrote with it is large enough to borrow for both sides. Mainstream historical fact. Across medieval villages in Central Europe, people leaned on simple signals, shouted words, bells, horns, and whistles to carry messages in winter when air was still and distances could be honest. Church bells told time and alarm. Shepherds' calls and horns summoned help or warned of strays. On the river, a few practiced notes sufficed to steer a day that had no appetite for long speeches. The prince may have charters. You have lungs and a willingness to repeat yourself. Both do what they can. You watch their sledges feel for the line you drew. The leading runner shaves a shallow feather of powder and keeps going as if proud of its haircut. The men move as if they have each strapped a little patience to each ankle. One calls across a single word, a name you know. The other lifts his staff and stabs the air twice in the old sign for scar. You mime the curve of the path and the small backward lean that carries a load safely around disappointment. They copy you with a kind of gruff grace and continue. You are not their master. You are their mirror for a minute. The river hums a long, low thought. You humor it with more listening. A pulse of short cracks spikes away from the mill race like the lines on a thoughtful brow. Then they stop and keep their counsel. The two men reach the straight and put their heads down like oxen that have remembered their trade. You raise your arm, palm out, and let it drift down. Their pace eases. Your markers hold. The sledge behaves because it has already rehearsed today's obedience. Quirky or fringe tidbit, a few neighbors believe that if you whistle the wrong pattern, the one you use for calling a dog on the river, you will call the river instead, and the river will answer with mischief. They keep a separate little reed whistle for crossings, plain and undecorated, and they never let it hang from the same thong as the sheepdog's whistle, lest the two teach each other bad manners in the dark. You do not keep two whistles, but you keep two habits. The slow two short, one long that means eyes here, and the softer single note that means I hear you. Across the channel a woman appears, shawl tight, basket at her hip. The particular tilt that means her household has sent her with the least foolish weight and the most important errand. She does not whistle. She waits. The men angle their load onto the ash-dusted landing, and one of them, without being asked, peels off along the twig line to meet her halfway. She falls in behind him and places her steps inside his. This is not gallantry. It is arithmetic. Two sets of weight staggered with a sober interval. You tilt your staff in a small salute for their shared sense, which is prettier than any story. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether there were formal codes for winter signaling on ice roads. In the 12th century, agreed sequences of horn blasts or posted marks recorded in town rules, or whether most communication stayed ad hoc, a braid of local habit, gestures, and a short repertoire of calls that changed from river bend to river bend. Charters love to catalog tolls and ferries. Icetime improvisations often leave only the echo that old ears remember and young ones declare they just invented. The men reach your bank and toss you a look that weighs the same as thanks. You lift the staff and dip it once, the winter bow that needs no waste. You point with it again, downriver. They nod, take the suggestion, and add two willows of their own where your line deserves another voice. Good handwriting invites marginal notes. You feel the day brighten a half shade at the cooperation, though the sun hasn't moved more than a finger. You permit yourself the pleasure of a very small show. You lay the staff flat to indicate, go on, then bring it upright to say, stop, then swing it low to say, left, and the men obey with theatrical solemnity, as if on a stage. It is a joke, the kind that warms without smoke. They exaggerate their bows and go back to seriousness, which is where most of winter lives. The woman crosses at last, and plants her basket on the ash you sifted earlier. She uncovers it to reveal two hard ends of cheese and a fist of onions, neither proud, both honest. She touches the edge of one willow marker with gloved fingers, as if it were a reliquary, then chuckles at herself for the thought and moves on. You let the moment drift away like breath. Back on the far bank, a younger lad, one of those who trusts his legs and disrespects his skull, puts fingers in his mouth and launches a whistle so clean it slices the morning. You answer with the softest version of your code and then hold up your palm. He pauses, reconsiders, and angles toward the thicker color where the shallow keeps its good opinion. He might think he decided that himself later. You plan to let him keep that story. Pride is cheaper when borrowed. You end the exchange by planting one more twig where the exit narrows, tipping it slightly backward to suggest respect. The farmen see it and copy the slant at their own trouble spot near the alder root. Across the white expanse, your quiet handwriting meets theirs and makes a sentence that runs bank to bank. You stand a moment longer, listening for anything the river has not yet told you. It tells you only that it is holding steady for now and would prefer you not to brag about it. You lift the staff in farewell, tilt the ferrule toward the willow for thanks, and let your breath become a small cloud that rises and vanishes without blaming anything for its vanishing. The figures across the way lower their arms. The day returns to being a day instead of a conversation. You check your rope, check your pockets, and check your own weight on your own feet, the three checks that have earned you more winter than any charm ever has. The river hums. The village begins its slow stirring. Your path is written enough for what comes next. You choose a place for the river to breathe, the way you choose a word you are willing to be quoted on carefully, on purpose, and near the edge, where it will do most good with least drama. Not at the ford itself. There the traffic owns the day. A little upstream of the landing where the current draws a shy bow under the ice will do. You test with the ferrule. Tap, tap, thump. The answer is firm enough to carry a kneeling person, and honest enough to admit there is water under the lid rather than dreams. You sweep the surface with your mitten to brush away the hoarfrost that likes to look helpful while hiding trouble. Powder skitters off like gossip denied an audience. From the sledge, you take the short-handled axe and the iron chisel that threads onto your staff when the job turns from asking questions to insisting on an answer. You set a bundle of reeds nearby, the same you cut from the backwater before snow made its treaty. A coil of rope waits as well, looped over a willow stake that will claim the hole when you leave. You sprinkle a ribbon of ash and chaff in a small horseshoe where your knees will go. Humility does not forbid prudence. The river pretends indifference. Ice is very proud until it is not. You begin by sketching a square the size of a breadboard with the axe, just enough to score the skin, not enough to bruise the bone of it. The blade rings a modest bell each time it meets the cold. You widen the cuts with the chisel, leaning your weight through the staff the way you lean on a patient friend who knows what you are asking and will not argue. The ice tells you through iron and wood and arm when your insistence becomes persuasion. You let it. Chips rise like dull glass with milk in them. They slide aside and accept their dismissal. You work one side, then the opposite, because balance pleases more than cleverness. When the square loosens, you push one corner down to let dark water rise and confess itself. It slides under the opposite edge, then returns, glass new and black as a pupil. You ease the slab aside with the chisel and tug it onto the surface to become a little white raft beside its own absence. Breath becomes a more serious thing here. It staggers your scarf like a small animal pawing to be let out. You let it out slowly. The river inhales once, a soft gulp, and then settles to the business of being water in winter quiet, strong, letting light fall into it and not telling you where it goes. You widen the mouth a palm's breadth on each side, not for vanity, only so a bucket will dip without tearing its lip. The chisel shoulders the work and the axe receives its nap. You wire the mouth with 2 cross sticks tied with hemp twine, an X set a hand's width below the lid, so an inattentive foot will meet wood before water. You drive the willow stake at the corner and tie a short loop from stake to cross sticks, a plain promise that your hole belongs to someone who will come back and mind it. A fringe of reed bundles goes around the rim where refreeze begins its fast lies. The reeds hold off those lies for an hour or two. You watch the black gloss turn to a patient gray rim, then to a skin. The reed fringe persuades the skin to be slower about it. Mainstream historical fact. Through long winters across medieval Central and Eastern Europe, villagers kept ice holes by the banks for water, for lowering fish baskets, and for work at mills. They marked them with stakes or brush, and slowed refreezing with straw or reeds, visiting daily with axe or chisel to keep the mouth open. The practice is ordinary and faithful, like sweeping a threshold that nobody praises and everyone uses. You kneel on your own careful ash, and hear the water's small talk minute clicks against the reed, a sigh under the cross sticks, the quiet suggestion that a dipper might be permitted. You take the bucket by its iron bail and lower it to touch, not to dive. It drinks politely and comes up with a lip of clear that smells of stone and cold and the patience the river has with people who ask nicely. You pour once into a jar. The second time you pour back, a gift that does not impoverish you. Your aunt would approve the good manners. The whole steams as if pleased to receive a bowl of its own breath back, quirky or fringe tidbit. Some neighbors keep a habit of flicking 3 grains of salt into the first water drawn to tame the river's tongue, or laying a crumb of bread on the cross sticks, so the mouth has something to chew that isn't people. You consider both customs too proud of their poetry and do a smaller thing instead. You touch the willow stake and say, "Stay," as if the world were a dog that might obey tone more than words. The stake stays. The world continues at its preferred pace, which is neither yours nor the stake's. Your knuckles complain about the metal bail. You rub them once and hide them back in wool. You thread the chisel off and let the ferrule have its dignity again. The square of lifted ice has already begun to fuse itself back to the surface like a guest who realized too late. that he should have left earlier. You nudge it farther to keep the rim honest. If it drifts back and seizes, tomorrow you will be chiseling 2 squares instead of 1, which feels like admitting you learned nothing. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether villagers in the 12th century cut such breathing holes mostly for drawing water and setting traps, or also with the intention of relieving pressure along the ice small vents meant to quiet cracks and prevent the sudden temper that can travel a mile in a blink. Chronicles prefer miracles and disasters. Charters prefer rents. Neither genre lingers over lowly holes. It may be that people called them breaths only in later speech, and that the 12th century kept fewer names for the quiet tasks it did every day. The hole does not answer the quarrel. It merely exists and keeps working. You set a thin switch fence, 2 sticks, and a cord 3 steps back from the rim, the simplest barrier that makes a sleepy walker inconvenient enough to wake. You scuff a little crescent of ash between fence and water for the same reason. On the stake you tie a bit of rag, a flag of nonsense, so the eye will notice and pour light. Nothing here is clever. Everything is slow. Winter rewards slow. The sound the river makes now is different from before you began. The anvil hum still runs through the channel, but near your square a hush settles, like a person who has been granted permission to breathe through the nose rather than the mouth. It is as unromantic as most true relief. You lower the bucket once more, just to watch the slip of water fold around it, a dark sleeve taking a pale wrist. When you raise it, 2 flakes of ice ride the lip like tiny boats, and then break on your jar's rim and vanish into their second career. You make a notch on the willow stake, 1 short line, in a column you will add to each day until thaw. The column is not for any clerk, it is for your own memory, which likes to argue with time. You chip a little more at the downstream edge, where the skin grows faster, and lay another reed to mock it. The reed responds by pretending it had planned to help all along. Reeds can be very noble when they are not being cut. A dog pads near, sniffs the stake, and decides you are respectable. You point him elsewhere with 2 fingers, and he honors your view, because you look as if you know what you are doing. You do, for this one small thing. You pluck the square slab you pushed aside and lay it tilted, like a roof on the downwind corner of the hole. It will catch snow and keep a shadow there. Another petty theft from refreeze. Petty theft is a useful trade in winter, if practiced against the correct adversary. The bucket hangs empty on its bail, and the jar waits full in the sledge. You stamp your feet gently to remind them they belong to legs. The hole looks back at you with no opinion. You touch the stake again, not from superstition, only from the sensible fact that touching a thing persuades your mind to remember it later. When you leave, your boot prints write a little bracket of care around the mouth. They will fill with drift in an hour. You will be back before the drift decides that it is smarter than you. You shoulder the rope, take up the staff, and give the hole the courtesy of a backward glance, the same you give anyone you are leaving who might do mischief if neglected. The river hums as before, yet you hear in it a note you wanted: less pressure at the rim, less sulk where the mill race tugs. You have not improved the world. You have only shaved a small edge off its foolishness and stacked that shaving with your other shavings. Winter applauds such work by not punishing it. That is all the applause you need. You bring the wicker trap from its hook in the shed where it has dried its manners since autumn. It is the length of your arm, belly round at the mouth, and tapering to a small, stubborn tail, woven of peeled willow that remembers the day you bent it over your knee. Inside, a funnel points inward like a soft-spoken porter. Welcome in, troublesome out. You run a thumb along the ribs to feel for winter's new opinions. The weave gives a small squeak and no splinters. A plaited cord closes the mouth. A short stick spans the rim for a bait post. You shake the trap once, upside down, and yesterday's ghost's 2 fish scales, a curl of reed, 1 haughty grain of sand fall out, and stop pretending to be important. At the river you kneel by the breathing hole you cut earlier, your knees on the ash horseshoe you left for them. The reed fringe still holds back the skin that wants to grow. A thin rime sulks at the edge and cracks like eggshell under your glove. You brush it aside with 2 slow sweeps and let the water show its patient dark again. The cross sticks feel firm under your hand. You loose 1 corner, lift and slide the trap's nose beneath, as you would send a polite guest through a narrow doorway with a steadying palm. The funnel looks ridiculous in air and sensible in water. Most useful things do. Bait invites philosophy in men with too much time. You decline philosophy and keep what works. A strip of last week's fish skin, dried hard as agreement and rubbed with a smear of tallow, goes on the bait stick. The smell is clean and arrogant at once. Fish are vain about certain perfumes. You add a thumb of stale rye for crumbs that will drift like gossip nobody admits to hearing. The funnel greets the scented water as if someone had written it a letter. You lower the trap until the mouth sits just below the lid, not deep, only where the cold thread of current will carry the news around. You tie the line from the trap to the willow stake with the temper of a person who wishes to meet his work later and find it still waiting. Not tight, just faithful. The cord slides through a wooden toggle cut from a sliver of horn, so winter hands will not quarrel with knots when called in a hurry. A little peeled twig rests on the cross stick, a white tongue the eye will find at dusk. You palm the ribs once, a good luck you would deny if asked. The dark below answers by saying nothing, which is encouraging. You sit on your heels and watch the faint swirls the trap makes as it finds its seat. Tiny flecks of chaff tumble from your cuff, and the water steals them one by one, polite as a clerk taking names. The river under ice thinks slower thoughts than in summer, but it still thinks. You listen for the far anvil hum that means the main current minds its work, and for the small hiss that means your whole approves what you have done. The reed fringe nods like old men at a meeting that continues long after anyone remembers why it began. Mainstream historical fact. Across medieval Central Europe, wicker fish traps baskets with inward-pointing funnels served ordinary households on rivers and backwaters, set beneath ice in winter to catch humble fish when fields slept. Great ponds and weirs belonged to lords and monasteries. Villagers kept side channels and coves, taking perch, burbot, roach, and their cousins wherever season and custom permitted. The craft is no marvel. It is patient willow, faithful cord, cold fingers, and the plain belief that hunger can be postponed. You shift a little aside and finger the line, counting a slow 30, then another, because people pretend not to hope, and then hope anyway. A bubble kisses the underside of the ice and slides away like a secret finding a new owner. You check the toggle, not because it needs checking, but because hands require work if they are to avoid inventing trouble. The staff lies across your thighs, warm on one side, cold on the other. A small truth about everything outdoors. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some neighbors hum into the hole 3 low notes, one high claiming the burbot will take it for the mill wheel and come to argue. Others drop a single hemp seed into the funnel, so the trap will remember its lineage. You allow yourself one unmusical hum and spare the seed for planting, which is a kind of faith more likely to pay interest in spring. When it is time, you draw the line slowly enough to make any watching otter yawn. The trap rises with a sulking wobble, its willow dripping small pearls that turn to frost the moment air remembers them. You lift until the mouth kisses the cross sticks and then tilt, draining river back to river. Inside, a dark flicker writes a line that means you may eat something that did not walk here. A perch stares with the offended dignity peculiar to fish. A smaller roach rehearses being a lesson next time and slips out while you are admiring your own neatness. You take the perch with fingers that remember winter's clumsiness and drop it into the pail where snow waits like a quiet cook. You reset the bait because success breeds tidiness. The rye, softened by baptism, becomes a more persuasive rumor. The skin still knows its trade. You lower again, not into the exact pocket that would be greedy, but a hand's breadth upstream where the flow toys with the edge. The line takes weight and reports confidence along your palm. The reed fringe yields, the cross sticks settle, and the whole recovers its ordinary face. You sit back and let your shoulders forget to be useful for half a minute. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how tightly rights to winter fishing were fenced by lords and churches in the 12th century here. Whether villagers kept customary leave to set small traps for the pot, or whether such leave had already narrowed to stated days, places, and dues that no one bothered to record until someone refused to pay. Charters speak loudly of great ponds and proud weirs. The lowly basket under ice leaves few witnesses beyond bones and bellies. The cold draws a clean line around every thought, making it hard to pretend to grandeur. You blow into your mittens and watch the steam join the afternoon like a shy guest. A jay complains from the alder and then tires of its own voice. You give the line a finger's lift, just enough to ask a question. The answer is a weight that was not there a moment ago. Agreeable gravity from a creature that mistook willow for silence. You draw again, patient, and the trap comes up with a slow unwillingness you respect. Inside, a burbot coils like a length of damp rope and practices looking ancient. You tip it into the pail beside the perch, and the snow admits both with polite chill. A second notch goes on the willow stake today's small ledger. You tighten the thong around the trap's mouth so no curious paw invites a theft while your back is turned. You lash the pail beneath the sledge thongs and tuck a fold of snow over it. Meat prefers shade in any season. Before you leave, you lay a fresh reed along the upwind rim to insult refreeze and reset the cross stick so the peeled twig faces the village. You draw the sledge a finger's breadth and stop, because stopping on purpose pleases the body more than stopping, because the rope had an opinion. The sky declines to choose between pale and paler. The air smells of iron, tallow, and a rumor of onion from some door along the lane. You let all of that be what it is and propose no correction. You walk back along your twig road with the staff leading its familiar call and response. Tap, tap, thump. The river answers with the anvil truth, unsentimental and sufficient. Nothing heroic attends you, only the modest pull of the rope, the small weight of the pail, and the idea that supper will be slightly less imaginary. The trap remains below, continuing unremarkable work without applause. You admire it by leaving it alone. On the bank, you straighten the sledge's nose and guide it into the ash mix you laid this morning. The runners rasp their thanks. You turn once to memorize the stake reed fringe, cross sticks, peeled twig pointing home, and fix the image where it will not be misplaced by chatter. The river hums the same long note as before, a metal string plucked by a careful hand. You answer with a nod no one sees, and step toward the kitchen smoke that would like to be your accomplice. You stand still long enough for the river to remember you again, the way a horse remembers a hand that does not rush. The staff rests across your palms like a scale of patience. From a doorway, the surface looks simple. Up close, it keeps a grammar of lines and shadows. You read it slowly and let your breath leave without comment. Cracks speak different dialects. A thin hair that darts from your boot is nervous. All talk, little strength. A broad gray seam with a darker tongue beneath is honest and wants respect. A nest of fine white threads near the bank is old gossip. They have told their story and no longer care to make it true. You lower the ferrule and ask beside each tap, tap, thump. The answers return through wood and bone before they reach the ear. A round, full thump is the sound you trust. A hollow, quick note is the sound you thank and avoid. You count in winter's language. 1 thump for a walker, 2 for a sledge, none for pride. The staff trains your arm to hear. You shift a half shoe forward and ask again. Light tells tales. Smooth glare near the mill race shines like a guilty forehead. You do not trust it. Where wind laid sugar and then left, the snow softens the brightness and makes a quiet floor. A small window brushed clear shows color enough. Steady green-blue is sensible. Cloudy edges are a cousin that borrows and forgets. The river sings when frost is deep. Sometimes the sound runs like iron stroked with a wet finger. Sometimes it pops like distant stove wood. Today it hums a long, low string that travels under your feet like a message that forgot its words but kept its tune. A sharp report jumps westward. You hold still, let the energy spend itself, and only then continue. You edge toward a fan of lines that bloom from a drowned stump. You set the staff tip between 2 rays and ask politely. The anvil note returns with a fuller chest than you expected. The rays are old, painted on a door that is still strong. You step between them as you would on floorboards set by a sober carpenter. Heel down, weight spread. Mainstream historical fact. Winter travelers in the medieval lands of Bohemia and its neighbors listened and looked for safety on ice-reading cracks, colors and sounds, testing with poles, keeping to known fords because ice could be a road and a trap in the same hour. No guild licensed such reading. The tools were eyes, ears, and habits passed hand to hand. Near the middle channel, the singing gathers itself, a deep vowel that swells and fades as if the river drew a bow over its ribs. Children call it a giant's fiddle. Elders call it weather speaking through oak. You count heartbeats between notes. The count is longer than yesterday's. Longer counts often mean thicker plates and a calmer mood. You watch for honeycomb in the shallows, the kind that comes with soft weather and makes brags out of fools. But today you find firm plates locked at sober seams. Your ferrule kisses an edge and meets a steady shoulder. You press a little and feel the resistance travel away, dissipating like grudge-meeting courtesy. The far bank holds its color. The near bank minds its chores, quirky or fringe tidbit. Some refuse to cross when the ice sings with teeth, a high chatter like thin pots clinking, saying the river is hungry for news and prefers to eat the messenger. Others insist a long hum is best luck St. Catherine walking, as if a veil brushed a stone floor. You have believed both, choosing whichever belief buys more patience. You set 3 fresh twigs where 2 seams meet and quarrel politely. One tilts forward confidence, one backward respect, one straight ask again. The wind slides a ribbon of powder along the line, and your peeled tongues catch it, making a small lace no one asked for. Lace is harmless when the road beneath it is sound. You pat the nearest twig and go on. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether winters in the 12th century here were milder or harder than later ones, whether warm centuries left rivers less reliable for long ice roads, or whether variability was the rule and memory the mischief. Chronicles report marvels. Fairs on ice, floods at Christmastide, carts lost, carts saved. Ordinary crossings like yours are shy on parchment. To keep the conversation honest, you kneel once more and put your ear close, not touching, listening for the near silent fizz that sometimes warns of soft places growing under a pretty face. Today there is only the low string and a quiet huff where your breathing hole minds its work. You let a small pride come and go without settling. Pride freezes into trouble. Quiet satisfaction melts into judgment. You move a few paces and listen without touching anything. Silence has flavors. There is the padded silence of deep cold, slow and forgiving, and the brittle silence before weather breaks. Today the silence is padded and slow. You decide to bring a second load before noon, while the silence still carries you. At the landing, you lay the staff across your knees and study the page you and the river wrote. Lines, twigs, footprints. The faint braid of runner marks everything, says the same sentence. Go. But go like someone who expects to be asked why. You rub your palms until a seam of heat opens and tuck it under your cuffs. Supper may include perch and burbot. They can wait. One last note from the singing. When the tone climbs and tries to be pretty, you step toward the duller color that scolds it. When the tone settles and becomes workmanlike, you cross the open stretch in 3 unfussy strides. These rules are for today only. Tomorrow the river will copy itself badly, and you will read again from the beginning. You rise, take the rope in your left hand, the staff in your right, and let your boot test the first slope of the landing. The ash and chaff keep their promise. The sledge remembers to follow. The river hums behind the ribs of ice, less proud now that someone listened and refused to be impressed. You give the willow markers one short nod, the nod you give a neighbor who did not make a fuss and begin. Midday arrives the way a shy guest slips into a room polite, a little too warm for the chair you saved it, trying not to change anything and changing it anyway. The top crust loosens first. Snow that held its chin high at dawn slumps a little, then sighs. Your boot writes a softer letter than in the morning. The serif smears. You stop at the landing and study the light. Where shade leans from willow and mill house, the surface keeps its sensible grain. Where sun strays longer, a wet sheen begins to practice being water. You angle for the shaded bend you have trusted in winters that remembered how to behave. The staff asks with a smaller voice. The answers come back full enough, but the skin near the bank has learned new tricks. You scatter a palmful of ash along the first 2 steps onto the ice, not because ash can hold the sun, but because ash can hold you. The rope's coil rides higher on your shoulder to keep it dry, and you tuck the tail so it will not wick foolishness along its length. The river's hum fattens in the warmth. Less iron, more cello. The reed fringe at your breathing hole drinks light and looks smug. You let it. The twigs you planted tilt forward with confidence, then backward with respect, just as you left them. You watch the wet edge where slush tries out a new tone. and you step one pace inland to keep to the older language. The sledge, light for now, follows with good manners. Midway across, you feel the topmost skin loosen under a dusting of powder. It does not break. It only changes the way it notices you. Your boots prefer shade. The staff prefers answers. You oblige both by following your own handwriting along the darker stripe. You think of bread left too near the hearth, crust softening, crumb learning to be bold. Softness is not danger if you respect its pride. Mainstream historical fact. In Central Europe's winters, travelers knew midday sun could blunt the top layer of snow and glaze the ice edges. So they favored morning and evening crossings or shaded approaches, adjusting routes toward banks that kept their chill. A day could have 3 different roads on one river, and all of them honest if you matched their hours. You pause at the healed crack you named in the morning and listen. The seam gives a proper, low answer, but the powder over it slumps like a tired shawl. You brush it aside with your mitten and expose the sober color underneath. The staff thumps. The note is workmanlike. You pass, careful as a person stepping over a sleeping dog. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some villagers lay small fir boughs at hot spots around noon, saying the green shade teaches the ice to remember winter. Others spill a dipper of well water at the landing to remind the river whose bucket feeds the village. You have carried boughs when you had them, and water when you had it. And you admit, both gestures make the mind cooler, even if the ice was going to cooperate anyway. You keep your rope from dipping when you bend to look. A wet rope chills a shoulder long after the sun has forgiven its brightness. In the slack water along the mill race, you see a clear pane under a skin of slush. It pretends to be new ice, and is only the memory of it. You honor the difference by walking where you told yourself to walk at dawn. The sledge nose tries to angle toward the lie. Your shoulder denies it without judgment. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how reliably hard noon warmth visited 12th century midwinters here. Whether the so-called warm century softened rivers more quickly each day than later times, or whether local banks and wind decided more than climate names ever did. Parchment remembers feast days. Ice remembers shadows. You trust shadows. At the far bank, you climb the ash your morning hand sifted, and the slope keeps its promise. You rub the runner noses with a thumb smeared in tallow for the next pull, and set a small wedge under the sledge so it will not choose to go home alone. The light in the yard looks honest again. The eaves drip one clear note and then decide not to continue. You stand a moment in the doorway shade until your breath becomes less of a spectacle. When you turn back, the path you chose glows dull and sensible, a line that belonged to noon and will belong to evening again soon. You let noon keep its little pride, and you keep your footing. Grease is a quiet language your hands know without needing to be taught again. You set the sledge on its plank and warm the tallow cup by the coals until the surface loosens to a modest smile. The cloth you use is clean in the way cloth can be clean in winter, more honest than spotless. You run your palm along each runner to learn where the grain remembered trouble since morning. Here a faint fur rises where ash rasped. There a dry whisper where slush licked and left. The scraper whispers once, twice, and the wood sentence reads smoother. You lay a thin line of fat along the full length, then work it in with cloth and patience. At the upturned nose, you rub longer. That is where arguments begin. At the inner edge, you are stingy. Too much there inside, sliding becomes a hobby. You listen with fingertips until the runner answers with that mute, even gloss your eyes can almost hear. You press the cloth into the loop of your belt so it won't become a snow-eating rag before you need it again. Straps next. One has fretted itself fuzzy where the rope worried it. You bind it with a wrap of wool yarn, making a soft collar that turns friction into agreement. The crossbar wedge you drove earlier sits true. Still you touch it, as if it were a sleeping child. The rope, flattered by inspection, yields its kinks when you roll them between thumb and forefinger. You retie the first hitch in slow time, because knots that are taught slowly remember longer. Mainstream historical fact. Wooden runners greased with animal fat or oil were common winter practice across medieval Central Europe, and simple wool wraps or leather collars protected high wear points where rope met wood. The knowledge lived in hands, not books, and every yard kept some version of it near the hearth. You spare a breath on the rope itself, the length your shoulder will carry, and rub a thumbnail's worth of tallow along its lay, then wipe most of it away. Rope should slide on cloth and bite on wood. Too much kindness makes it silly. You dust the landing path with the heel of your glove to be sure the ash still shows where you want it. It does, though noon's warmth asked impudent questions. Quirky or fringe tidbit. A few here mix ash into their tallow, so frost can recognize a friend, spreading a peppered sheen along the runners. Others rub a sliver of beeswax at the very tips, to teach the nose not to peck. You tried the ash once, and decided you preferred your ash underfoot and your fat alone. A segregation of duties that pleased both. You checked the staff ferrule, too. A nick there can teach your hand a wrong note. A few strokes on the stone, a touch of fat wiped away before it offends the ice, and the tip sings the proper dull thump again. You tap it on the sill and count the sound as if measuring thread. Your mittens get a new twist at the wrist. Your scarf's pin gets nudged, so it will stop trying to be a banner when you lean. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue which lubricants were most common in the 12th century. Here animal tallow, lard, rendered marrow, or plant oils where they could be spared. Written records seldom list small greases spent on runners, and the ground keeps their memory poorly. You suspect kitchens answered most sledges, because kitchens answered most things. You lift the sledge nose and feel the change. A steadier glide, less brag. The ash path accepts the gloss without complaint. You take 10 practice steps with no load, because rehearsal turns work into habit, and habit keeps pride from inventing a story about how it saved you. The rope rides your shoulder like a trained bird that forgot it ever had wild cousins. You set everything back on its peg with the satisfaction that comes when materials and intentions shake hands and nobody looks for witnesses. Where boats once bobbed and made their little arguments with wind and oar, a white road lies plain and not interested in being admired. You stand where the ferry usually scolds and grins and count the changes. No rope sagging over the channel, no wet planks smelling of river, no pole marks on the bank. Instead, willow tongues mark a lane. Ash darkens the approaches, and sledges pass, as if a hidden carter had laid out his yard across the water and invited everyone in. You remember the ferryman's hands, how they kept rope neat, and knew river moods now busy, mending a thwart and pretending not to miss the trade. He nods at you from the bank, a man benched by the season and resigned to watching his crossing be done without him. You tip your staff in quiet respect. A road replaces a boat without asking the boat's feelings. Winter is blunt that way. The ice bears not only you, but the village's errands. A sack of rye, a bound sheaf of flax from a loft that would like more space, a barrel hoop carried like a crown, a cradle on a sledge, because a neighbor across the water has a baby and fatigue to match. Your twigs guide them around last year's crack that keeps its biography under snow. You watch the lines coordinate as if a clerk had written them out. No clerk did. People who wish to go and people who wish to return have found a compromise under their boots. Mainstream historical fact. Frozen rivers in medieval Bohemia and neighboring lands often served as seasonal roads. When winter came, hard crossings multiplied. Fords lengthened, carts and sledges replaced boats, and the work of ferrymen paused or shifted to keeping approaches safe. Nature levied no toll when it cooperated. Lords sometimes did. You consider the small economy such changes make. The ferryman saves his back. The smith sells more runners. The rope maker enjoys an extra coil or two ordered by households pretending to be careful instead of late. On the far bank, a boy with bone skates loops like a satisfied comma in the shallow and nearly collides with a stack of brush. His mother's voice catches him by the coat and pins him back to grammar. He scowls and learns. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some households hang the ferry's little bell in the shed during deep freeze, so it will not ring up a wind by accident. Others nail a broken oar blade above the door for luck, as if wood that once pushed water could persuade ice to be polite. The oar blade looks fine as a sign. You doubt it negotiates with seasons. You stand midstream and listen for the road's own sounds. Boots write soft plural notes. Sledges murmur. Staff speak in measured syllables. The great hum under all of it keeps time. A crack somewhere upstream performs a flourish and then grows ashamed of itself. You wait a count of 5 before stepping again, a courtesy more than a rule. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how winter tolls and rights were handled in the 12th century, Whether lords remitted ferry fees when ice made the river a public floor, whether market dues shifted when routes changed, whether old privileges woke under snow or slept until thaw, the papers keep their pride. The ice does its work. Village memory stitches a working custom somewhere between the two. At the landing, a handcart rests on its side, like a beetle waiting to be righted. You and two others set it back on its feet without medals. The owner thanks you with a nod, and the offer of a dried apple slice that tastes like summer translated into leather. You chew it down to the sting of pips and wish the ferryman that kind of sweetness later when the road goes back to water and his rope finds its work again. You cross once more for the comfort of the pattern. Step, thump, step, glance down the line of twigs, adjust nothing, arrive. The ferry will return to its stories when thaw accepts bribes. For now the river pretends to be simple, and you accept the pretense in exchange for errands done quietly. Market day tries to be lively without much success, which is exactly how winter prefers its business. Competent, muffled, not impressed with itself. Stalls huddle near the bank where the wind forgets to test them. A cloth merchant has spread his goods on a plank set over two sledges. The colors behave as if asleep under the pale sky russet, walnut smoke. A woman sells onions by the fist, counting with a thumb that remembers every loaf her house has measured this month. A man offers salt in small twist skins and keeps his scale close to his chest, as if the air might steal it. You trade slowly, because slow trades last longer in the memory, and teach your hands how to be polite again after pulling ropes. Rye goes out, a thin wedge of cheese comes in. You sniff it once and let it be proud. Pride keeps cheese interesting. A boy walks past with a basket of eggs, wrapped in straw like a line of meek moons. He walks the very edge of your ash path, and you shift aside one pace to let his caution own the moment. Someone has set a small brazier behind a board, and its heat makes a ceiling over the ankles of everyone nearby. You drift through the warm patch without calling attention to your pleasure. The smith has brought hooks and nails in a leather bag. He pours them into a wooden bowl with a sound like hail on summer thatch. You take 2 nails and 1 hook, and repay him in onions, and a promise to send him a wedge of green alder when you split the next stack. He lifts a shoulder. Enough. Mainstream historical fact. Winter did not end trade in medieval villages. Small markets gathered near fords and along banks, with barter and coin both in play. Foodstuffs cured to travel, tools simple enough to be mended by owners, and warm things wool, felt, wax worth more for their honesty than for prettiness. The river near a safe crossing drew feet even when boats slept. A fiddler tries a tune with mittened fingers, then thinks better of it and tucks the instrument back under his cloak, choosing to sell cordage today instead of music. You buy a short length for tying reeds and tell yourself you will not turn it into something ambitious. A neighbor weighs the salt twist in his palm, as if the weight might tell him stories. You buy one too, because salt stories are long and useful. Quirky or fringe tidbit. A few stall keepers warm small stones by the brazier and drop one into a mitten or a pocket for the walk home, calling them market hearts. Others slap cheese and listen for a ringing note to prove it is winter ready. You smack your wedge lightly. It answers with a dull, confident thud. Good enough. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how formal 12th century winter markets were along rivers like this, whether a reeve marked off spaces and collected dues even when stalls hid behind sledges, or whether neighbors simply showed up where the path was safe and sold what days allowed. Documents prefer fairs with saints' names. Your day prefers onions with honest skins. You watch the flow of people follow your twig line at a respectful distance, each walker borrowing another's caution. A woman tucks a packet of flax tow into her sleeve and thanks no one in particular. A child with bone skates slung over a shoulder stares at the brazier as if fire were a visiting beast. The wind arrives and takes a look around, decides to mischief elsewhere, and leaves the canvas to sag without shame. You buy a small lump of beeswax because it smells like summer patience, and because every hinge in your house has decided to be elderly at once. The seller wraps it in a scrap of linen and ties it with a twist of red wool that looks like someone's idea of luck. You do not correct the idea. Luck and wool both work better when not corrected. On the way out, you scatter a thin veil of ash on the board, where 3 stalls have polished snow to pride. No one thanks you. No one needs to. Pride is quieter afterward. You tuck the salt and the cheese into your pouch. Press your palm once to the rope on your shoulder, as if greeting an animal that knows you, and step back toward the river sentence with a mind suited again to errands. You find the old neighbor waiting on his stool with the posture of a bundled broom, hat pulled low, hands folded into themselves the way winter teaches. He has that stubborn brightness in his eyes that says he will accept help only if it looks like you are borrowing his company. You make it look exactly so. The sledge kneels in ash. You lay a folded cloak on the deck and a coil of rope at the head to make a pillow that will not wander. 2 billets crosswise become rails so the world keeps its distance. You invite him with a tilt of the staff and the puzzled honor. Do a guest you've known all your life. He stands, tests the rope with his fingers as if it were a song from younger days, and nods once. You take his elbow, not as if it were fragile, but as if it were important. He climbs with the dignity of a church cat, slow, precise, sure of his right to be there. You settle his feet under a blanket, then bind a soft strap across his knees, not tight, just faithful. He sniffs at the knot and gives it his approval by not mentioning it. The rope comes over your shoulder. The staff finds its balance in your fist. The landing waits with ash and chaff and that thin sheen of noon already thinking of evening. You move when he is ready, which is when you are ready. The sledge starts as if remembering a lesson. Your steps fall into the old pattern. Look, listen, ask, step. The first tap answers with the anvil voice that has comforted you all morning. You keep to the shaded edge, where the willow's long fingers lie on the ice like a blessing. The weight behind you is not heavy, it is careful. You feel it in your shoulder like a hand that wants to be included. Mainstream historical fact. In medieval winters across Central Europe, elders and the infirm were commonly moved on hand. Sledges or simple drags wrapped in cloaks, with neighbors guiding the rope and staff along tested fords. Parish charity could be as plain as a strap over knees, and a slow, safe route to hearth or chapel. No guild owned this work. Households did. Your markers receive you as if they had been expecting company. The twig near the healed crack leans backward in your code respect. You angle the nose. The runners acknowledge by not arguing. Behind you, the old man makes a small, contented sound that might be a hymn with no words or simply joints, discovering they have an opinion about warmth. You pretend not to notice, which is the loudest kindness you know. At midstream, the river hums its low string, and the mill race adds a harping thread that would like attention. You deny it. Your steps are copybook neat. The staff thumps translate into your bones, and the rope hums against your coat like a tame thought. You pause once to let the elder look out over the white road where boats sleep, and he tilts his head as if recognizing the place where 2 long stories meet, waters and winters. Then you go on because pauses are warmer when brief. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some here insist the sledge must start with the passenger facing the village so the house can pull. Others turn the rider forward so the path will not be offended. A few count their steps in 12s, whispering a saint's name at each dozen, and swear the ice likes arithmetic. You split the difference, feet toward home when going home, eyes toward the day when going out, and do your counting in silence. At the far bank, the slope lifts like a problem set by a kind teacher. You shorten the rope, lean a fraction more, and let the ash you sifted in the morning spend itself on your behalf. The runners rasp in gratitude. 2 breaths later, you reach ground that remembers dirt. A young man you do not ask for appears from the market cluster and puts his hand to the crossbar for the last 2 steps, performing the public part of the mercy you have already done in private. You allow him this credit. His back will learn the music soon enough. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how formal poor relief and elder care were in 12th century Bohemia, whether confraternities or parish alms had recognizable duties this early, or whether neighbor help and kin obligation did most of the work without leaving ink. The ledgers talk of rents and candles. The lanes remember sledges and hands. You draw the sledge into the lee of a reed screen, someone set against the wind. The old man's face loosens from winter's careful mask. He clears his throat as if to deliver a pronouncement, and then chooses the kinder speech of silence. You unwind the knee strap, help his feet find the ground, and stand close enough to be his second balance while he negotiates the last proud business of rising. He pats your sleeve twice, the village's oldest signature for thanks. You accept it by not making it into a ceremony. On the way back, you reset the strap neatly, smooth the cloak, and tap the twig near the scar with the ferrule so the river knows you remember. The path home feels lighter, not because the sledge is empty, but because work that should be plain was plain, and the day prefers that. You let your breath go in a long seam that rises and disappears without advice. The river hums. The staff asks. The ice agrees. You return for the next load with your shoulder already shaped to its quiet duty. The mill stands with its winter posture hunched roof, narrow eyes of windows, wheel wearing a shawl of ice teeth. You know its moods from other seasons. Quick chatter in spring spate, steady clop in rye months. Now a slow, obstinate turn that wants coaxing more than orders. The miller's dog announces you without commitment and returns to warming one side, then the other, at the door. You greet the dog and the door and the silence, which is the true master of the place in deep frost. The mill race narrows here, shouldered by stones that remember stronger hands than yours. Ice has crept from both sides to shake hands across the channel, leaving a tight black ribbon that breathes, then forgets, then remembers again. You kneel on the plank the miller laid last year for such chores, and set your knees on a scatter of ash you saved for them. The staff surrenders its ferrule. The iron chisel threads on, turning your question rod into a tool that announces its intent. You listen first, as always. The race hums under the crust with a low, determined note. The wheel clicks once, a tired tongue against teeth, then falls quiet. You score the lip with the axe where the current pretends to be tired. Chips rise like thin plates of poor glass. You slide them aside with the chisel's shoulder and let the stream carry them under the wheel to be forgotten. You widen the narrow with 2 patient bites on opposite edges so the flow will not sulk. The wheel answers with a single cluck, then a longer sigh, as if waking from a nap and deciding to be reasonable. Upstream, a guiding plank is wedged to push the water's will toward the paddles. It had drifted by an inch, the kind of inch that grows into argument. You nudge it home with the chisel and tap the peg with the staff's butt. The water accepts the fresh sentence and puts its shoulder where it earns its bread. The paddles free themselves of their lacework and turn slow, then steadier, lifting a thin fringe of spray that freezes into pearls along the lower edge. The miller appears, nods without wasting words, and lifts the sluice a finger's breadth, then sets it down again with the authority of someone who has argued with winter for many years and prefers truces. Mainstream historical fact. Watermills worked across 12th century Bohemia and its neighbors, grinding grain for village and lord alike. In winter, people kept mill races open where they could chopping lips, laying boards, and coaxing flow under ice so wheels turned slowly rather than sleeping and seizing. You clear the downstream lip too, because a mouth that swallows must also breathe. The chisel bites, the hole opens, the wheel's voice lowers to a workman's tone that respects ears. You brush slush off the sluice board with your glove and lay a fist of reeds where ice loves to begin its lies. The dog watches with the interest of one who approves of any task that leads to warm flour and crumbs. Snow on the sill above the stone's beads, then freezes again, as if undecided about the day's opinions. You test the wheel by hand, one push at the rim with your mitten, not to boast, only to learn what it will confess. It turns the width of a finger and then takes interest on its own. Inside, the stones give their low, patient whisper, stone on stone with grain between, the sound of winter becoming bread. The miller throws one look at the sky and one at the race. You understand the sum without arithmetic, another wedge of light before evening. Enough meal for 2 houses more. Bearings kept obedient until thaw. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some millers tie a scrap of red cloth to the axle on Epiphany, or chalk a small cross on the first paddle to teach the wheel good manners through the year. Others set a crust on the sluice board the first morning after hard freeze, calling it the wheel's breakfast, so it will remember to keep its teeth. You lift a slab of forming ice that had decided to be permanent and lean it where the sun can shame it. The miller passes you a palm of warm hulls from the sieve. You pocket them because warm is a currency that spends in many ways. He says nothing. You say nothing. The stones keep their whisper. You add a peeled willow stake at the race mouth to warn a careless foot that flow hides under a pretty skin. and you sift a thin arch of ash on the working plank, so his boots will not invent a lesson. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue which wheel forms were commonest here this early undershot, along shallow streams or breastshot where a fall had been contrived. Whether mills normally shut in the hardest weeks, or whether stubborn places kept them turning, if only to spare the bearings and keep toll due. Records list mills. They rarely describe how each January actually behaved. Before you leave, you draw a shallow line with the chisel across a new lip that thinks it has a future. It will remember the lesson for an hour. Tomorrow, it will require the lesson again. Winter believes in repetition more than argument. You agree. You thread the ferrule back onto the staff, lay the chisel on its peg, and clap your gloves once to mark the end of a small chapter. The dog sighs, which is the mill's way of being grateful. You answer by listening until the wheel's voice settles into the background song you wanted unshowy, even willing to work without asking to be admired. Then, you step from plank to shore, letting the ash take your weight, and give the race a last glance that means, keep your temper while I am gone. You cut reeds where the backwater keeps a memory of summer stalks tall as your shoulder, tops tufted with last year's gossip. The side's bite is modest. The stalks surrender with the faintest squeak, a sound winter prefers to loud virtue. You bind handfuls with twists of their own skin, the way rope teaches you that every plant wants to be two things, itself and string. Bundles line up on the bank like obedient geese, all heads one way, all tails the other, already thinking about becoming walls. Along the landing, you choose 3 spots where waiting collects, and the wind remembers lanes through the willow. You set 2 stakes, each willow wands you cut in autumn when sap was dreaming, and drive them with the staff's butt until the ground agrees to be helpful. The reed bundles lean in, bellies touching, and you weave a few wands through their ribs, so they will remember to act as one. A windbreak does not argue with the wind. It disagrees politely, and lets people do their errands slower and warmer. You learn small engineering again while pretending you always knew it. Faces turn away from the north. Edges sit low so snow will drape into a blanket. Gaps are left at the bottom so drift will not lift the whole into foolishness. You stitch the top with a cord of hemp the miller owed you in gratitude, and tie it in square knots that cannot boast, and therefore cannot fail. You step back, and the wind steps forward to test your work. The reeds answer with a soft whisper instead of a shout. Whisper is victory enough. You lay brush in front hazel and willow with the cut ends all one way, overlapping like shingles. A bench in miniature for boots that would like to stop skating, while their owners barter for onions. A reed mat becomes a curtain at the market corner, 2 pegs and a cross stick, so hands can count coin without freezing their clarity. You stand in the lee and notice how the air loses its teeth. Steam from your breath rises and does not run away at once. A place becomes a room when it shelters a sentence. Yours says, wait here without complaint. Mainstream historical fact. Reeds, brush, and wattle screen served everyday building in medieval Central Europe. Fences, hurdles, windbreaks, walls for sheds and booths at winter markets light, cheap, quickly repaired, often smeared with clay when meant to last. On riverbanks, simple reed shelters and brush hurdles softened wind for ferries and fords, when work could not be moved indoors. 2 children hover near the new wall as moths hover near a cloak. They feel its lee and begin to giggle as if they had just invented comfort. You hang a little reed curtain by the rescue pole to privacy for quick changes of socks, a place to rub life back into the narrow, complaining animals at the ends of legs. The ash you sifted in the morning darkens the floor of each shelter until it looks like the inside of a useful thought. Quirky or fringe tidbit. A few neighbors insist that the first bundle in a shelter must be cut with the wind at your back, so the wall remembers who it defies. Others prefer 1 green reed hidden among the pale to keep the room alive, and swear a green reed squeaks less. You oblige the green reed because squeaks tell the wind a story, and the wind enjoys being the hero. You carry 1 more bundle to the far side of the ford, where gossip strays into drafts. The older woman with the basket of flax tow settles against it with a sigh so honest it counts as a blessing. She pulls a thread and mends a glove with the concentration usually reserved for saints and stubborn lids. For a minute, everyone behaves as if summer had a small outpost here and had promised to hold it until dusk. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how much reed and wattle featured in winter market setups this early in the 12th century, whether booths and screens were common along fords, or improvised from whatever hedgerow offered that week. The ground leaves little trace unless clay was smeared on, and texts prefer to catalog dues paid, not walls woven. Before leaving, you lace one shelter's feet with a cord, so a gust cannot roll it into the river like a lazy barrel. A simple toggle makes untying polite when you need to move it. You notch the stake tops with your knife in your private shorthand. One notch for the north wall, two for the mill side screen, so if snow hides everything later, your own hands will remember what they built. You rub a thumbnail of tallow on the cord's knot, so it will consent to come free with mittens and not demand teeth. You stand in the lee of your work and allow yourself the smallest luxury of stillness. The river hums the same low string. The wheel turns slow and convinced. The shelters talk quietly among themselves, reed to reed, about being useful. A woman slips into the shade and counts coins. A man removes a glove, fixes a strap, and does not curse. The wind, offended at being ignored, goes to make mischief elsewhere. On your way back to the yard, you carry the last two bundles for repair stock. One you lean near the landing for the next person who understands what a reed can be. The other, you stand by your door, a pale sheaf that looks like a promise kept in reserve. You brush a dusting of snow from your sleeves and smile at the thought that rooms can be made in open air, and that winter, if not asked to admire itself, sometimes admires neatness enough to leave it alone. You unroll the straw mats you plaited in autumn, wide tongues of sun kept for a day that forgot its manners. Each mat smells faintly of field and mouse. You beat it once on the threshold, so only the honest straw remains. At the landing, where the northerly presses its sharp questions, you set two willow poles and lash a mat between them, low enough to trip drifting snow before it gathers speed. Another mat goes along the short path from gate to bank, a bent wall that persuades the wind to choose a different errand. Straw whispers where canvas would scold. Winter prefers whispers. You stitch each bottom edge with spare willow so the mats do not lift their hems and sail away. A hand-span gap stays at the ground so drift settles instead of prying the whole thing loose. Your glove runs along the weave and the air changes fewer teeth. More breath you can keep. People will stand here later, rub life back into their hands, and never notice a mat is doing half the work. That is the correct fame for winter helpers. None at all. At the bank, a noon glaze has formed where the sun flirted and then forgot you. You dust ash in two modest arcs, and the shine grows shy again. The reed shelters you set earlier nod at the new walls, rooms like having neighbors. A small lane appears house to mat, mat to reed, reed to river so errands can walk without hunching. Mainstream historical fact: straw hurdles and mats wattled from grain stalks or marsh reeds were common winter windbreaks across medieval Central Europe, tied to poles along fords, stalls, and paths so work could continue when northerlies tried to turn every doorway into a scold. Corky or fringe tidbit: some households thread a single red wool hair through the first binding, so the north won't learn your name, and a few spit once through the weave before raising it. To send gossip past rather than in, you give the mat a firm, friendly pat instead. The gesture is warm and cheaper than thread. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether 12th century village windbreaks here were mostly rye and oat straw from fields or finer river reed reserved for better kept yards, and whether dues were ever asked for windbreak spaces along public landings. Charters name stone and timber. Straw leaves fewer sentences behind. You stand on the lee side and let your lungs practice ease. The river's hum rounds off, as if a hand cupped a whisper. A child stops, discovers the warm ribbon of air, and grins without asking why. You tighten one lashing and push a peg deeper until it decides to belong. Then you walk the short tunnel you have made house to mat, mat to mat, mat to reed to the water's skin, and step onto the ice with shoulders that no longer argue with every gust. The day becomes slightly more polite, which is as much praise as winter requires. You take the cloak and the working shawl from their peg and carry them to the hard, clean drift beside the willow. The snow there is new enough to be honest, old enough to be firm. You lay the cloth flat and beat gently with the smooth stick you keep for this job, no cudgel, only a persuader. Dust leaps like shy birds. Grease ghosts loosen. The cold bites odors and keeps them. You flip, beat, and smooth with the palm, then draw the cloth across the crust so the crystals comb the nap without tearing. The snow answers with a soft hiss, as if pleased to be of use. Mittens come off for a moment, because hands know more than wool will report. You rub the hem where smoke loves to live. Work fresh snow into the fold with small circles, then brush it away with the heel of your glove. Color returns by patience that owes nothing to water or fire. You shake the shawl once toward the mill, and once toward the village. An old habit that pretends to send someone else the troubles you just beat free. The air approves. It always favors industry that does not ask for applause. You fold the cloth, press the fold into the drift so frost settles its temper, and hang the piece over your forearm, where it will not learn new creases. Your fingers scold you for the cold you invited. You answer at the reed shelter with a small ceremony. A coal pan pulled near, a thumb of tallow and beeswax warmed to a kindness, and a length of wool yarn for the worst places. You smear the salve along the web between thumb and first finger, then across knuckles that have been counting river notes since dawn. The skin drinks with a sting that feels like yes. You wind yarn twice around a cracked thumb to keep split edges from gossiping apart. Tuck the tail, and flex until the joint remembers obedience. A little salve goes on boot seams, and on the rope-burn stripe along your coat cuff. Nothing wasted, nothing bragged. Mainstream historical fact. Folk in cold lands used winter snow to dry wash woolens and furs, beating and rubbing on clean drifts to lift grease and grit when water and lye were scarce or harsh, saving suds and fuel for better weather. Simple fat and wax salves guarded chapped hands so work could continue. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some here pass a cloak through a breath of juniper smoke to persuade old smells to move out, or lay linen under the full moon for whitening, though no one agrees which moon does better. Others spit on the first crack of the season to seal it, bravado that comforts more than it cures. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how early and how widely snow cleaning was practiced in 12th century Bohemia. Later words praise it in many northern places, but village habits are poor at leaving ink. Recipes for salves tallow, goose grease, beeswax, resin shift in the record, and it is hard to know which mixtures were common among the poor. You hang the cloak and shawl back on their pegs in the lee of the straw mat. The reed curtain keeps the small warmth you borrowed from the coal. Mittens receive your humbler hands with fewer complaints. You look to the river still humming its anvil note, still holding its ordinary pride, and you nod as if to say, I have mended what touches me. Keep mending what carries us all. Evening decides to be useful. The sun tilts, the small wet sheen at the banks turns shy, and the top crust that slumped at noon remembers how to carry its weight. You stand where ash meets ice and wait one full breath longer than patience requires. The ferrule asks. The anvil note returns steadier, as if a hand had smoothed the day's wrinkles. You pull the rope across your shoulder and feel how the fibers stiffen into better manners when the air cools. You choose the shaded bend again, the lane your morning self wrote. Powder that behaved like sugar now behaves like salt, fine and bright and willing to mind directions. The staff taps ahead in short questions. The answers are plain. A thin crescent moon hangs over the mill like a nail left in the sky. You keep your gaze low where usefulness lives, and count 3 careful strides before glancing up again. You steer your boots onto the evening glaze with respect. The crust is not new ice. It is corrected snow, and correction forgives only once. You shorten the rope by a turn so the sledge's nose will not practice optimism at the curve. The runners purr, then hush. Breath leaves you in small clouds that decide to stay near, as if the cold were a shepherd gathering them. Mainstream historical fact. Travelers in medieval winters often favored dawn and dusk for hauling harder surfaces. Firmer snow, less slush at banks adjusting errands to the daily freeze-thaw, so loads moved when the ground consented. Evening crossings were common when the weather held. Wind redeems itself by going slack. Sounds sharpen the faint clicking under the lid, the slow jaw of the wheel, your rope whispering over cloth. You listen for brittle music and hear none. The moon's thin light is enough because it makes no dazzle. The world lies in grays you can read with your boots. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some here flip a pebble onto the surface before the first night's step, to teach the crust to harden, and others rub the ferrule in ash, so the ice will recognize a friend. You allow yourself the ash rub. It leaves a soot kiss that comforts the hand more than the river. Halfway across, you pause where the healed crack sleeps. You brush away a powder film and ask again. The answer is workmanlike. You place 2 quick twigs, 1 forward tilt, 1 straight, so any late traveler will read your evening punctuation. On the far bank, your straw mat breathes a warmer ribbon of air than the lane beside it, and you let your shoulders borrow that kindness a moment. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how widely night lighting was used on rural crossings, this early horn lanterns, rushlights, pine splints, whether most walkers trusted moon and habit or carried flame that wind would bully. Records list candles for chapels. Lanes keep quieter ledgers. You haul one last small stack of alder and stop while the day is still your ally. The rope coils without sulking. The staff finds its peg. You scuff a thin arc of ash at the landing for whoever decides to be brave after you, an invitation to be brave correctly. When you look back, your twig sentence shines with a modest confidence, and the river answers with a tone that says, "Keep your bargains, and I will keep mine." Children find the shallows before you do. They always do. Polished bones sit on their feet like 2 pale smiles, leather thongs crossed, a stick in each mitten to push the world backward. You stand at the landing and let them finish their laughing. Then you walk the edge with your staff and write 1 more neat curve of twigs around the deeper tongue by the alder. Their breath pops in the dusk like small lanterns. The river keeps its long, even hum under their clatter. A girl tests the crust with a brave heel and looks to you for the verdict she has already chosen. You answer with a palm, low and slow. Stay in the wash of your markers. Keep your stick short. Mind the line where the mill race teaches bad ideas. They nod and begin the old game, 1 foot skimming, 1 foot resting, poles stabbing a rhythm that even the crows respect. Bone clicks on ice like spoons at a quiet table. Joy is a sound that travels well over frozen water. Mainstream historical fact. Across medieval Central and Northern Europe, people, often children, used bone skates carved from horse or cattle leg bones, strapped on with leather and propelled by 1 or 2 poles. Archaeology finds them by fords and ponds, and texts mention winter play on bones, plain transport as well as sport. A boy's thong loosens. You kneel, retie it with a square knot that remembers work, and tuck a wisp of wool under the strap so the edge will stop scolding his ankle. He shows you a secret. The bones are rubbed with kitchen fat to make the frost friendly. You approve of the cleanliness, if not the theory, and send him off with a gentle tap of the staff on the safe line. He aims himself like an arrow and becomes a sentence you can read until the curve erases him. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some here carve a tiny cross or star on the bone's nose so the ice forgets to be jealous, or tie a red thread around 1 pole for luck. Others swear that whistling makes you faster, provided you do not look at the moon. Straw in socks, bone on ice, a stick for grammar recipes for flight that costs nothing. You plant an extra twig where dusk hides your earlier caution, and tamp it with the ferrule until it stops arguing. The children circle back in a tidy flock, skimming the margin where the water sleeps shallow, skirts lifting, mittens proud of their own breath. You carry their laughter like a coal kept under ash, warm enough to light the last errands. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how common bone skating was in 12th century Bohemia itself finds exist in neighboring regions, but local evidence is patchy, and it is unclear whether people here skated mostly for play, messages, or practical crossing. Words are few, bones are shy, habits travel more easily than ink. When they are done, you walk the line once more, tap, tap, thump, and hear only the workman's note you prefer. You harvest 2 forgotten sticks, set them upright by the reed shelter for tomorrow's games, and brush a thin arch of ash at the landing so small feet will start where sense begins. The river hums, the bones rest. Evening closes its clean book and leaves the page you wrote today unblotted. Moon lays a thin road across the ford and you borrow it. You wait a breath past readiness, letting crust harden its last finger's breath. The ferrule asks. The anvil note returns plain. Rope shortens by 1 turn, so the sledge's nose minds you at the curve. You step onto the glaze you groomed at dusk ash-dark arcs, peeled willow tongues shining like small coins. Shadows are useful now, deeper at the mill race, softer in the lee of reed screens. You keep your gaze where utility lives 5 steps ahead, never farther counting a quiet 3 between each thump. Halfway, you brush powder from the healed seam and ask again. Workman's tone answers. The sack of rye rides steady. The small twist of salt keeps its pride in your pouch. Breath gathers and stays near, as if the cold were shepherding it. A distant dog breaks the silence, then thinks better. The river hums its low vowel, pleased with evening discipline. Mainstream historical fact. Night hauling was common in hard winters, firmer crust, colder banks, less slush, so grain, salt, and fuel. Moved when paths consented, rather than when daylight bragged. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some turn a crust toward the moon, so the loaf will remember to rise. Others keep a pinch of salt under the tongue, to keep words from freezing. You settle for a palm pressed to the sack, enough theater to steady the mind. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how often rural walkers used lanterns on ice-horn shades, rush lights, pine splints, or whether moon and habit did the work. The ink notices chapel candles more than lane lights. You reach the farm mat, where straw returns a ribbon of gentler air. The sack changes owners with a nod. Onions replace salt in the pouch. You lengthen the rope for the lighter return, and look back once. Twigs as low stars, ash as ink. The river holding its bargain under glass. You begin home slow, on purpose, so night will keep liking you. Wolves explain themselves to the hills, and the hills refuse to argue. The sound arrives thin, more thread than cloth, and goes on its business. Closer. Kitchen lids tick as steam chooses one hinge over another. Smoke lifts straight for once. You stand at the landing and let both truths coexist. The far talk of hunger, the near talk of supper. A neighbor's door opens one ladle of broth to the step for a breath of cold. To season, it then shuts. You pull the rope and count your steps by the sound of your own coat. You guide the sledge with 2 fingers at the nose where ash met glare at dusk. The crust has set. The bank's treachery is dozing. You mark one more twig at the narrowing and tip it backward in your code respect. The wheel turns its slow jaw. Somewhere a hen mutters in her sleep. Your boot meets the stripe you groomed at noon, and the day forgives you again. Mainstream historical fact. Wolves ranged Bohemian forests in the 12th century. Winter sound carried them into villages' hearing even when they kept to trees, while houses cooked stews of grain, root, and fish, lids chattering on simple pots. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some toss a bone to the river, so forest heath will stay busy elsewhere. Others chalk a small mark on the door latch before dusk, to persuade hungry eyes to pass by. You chalk nothing. You mind rope and angle, and prefer the quiet grammar of ash. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how frequent wolf incursions into settled valleys where this early chronicles love fearful marvels. Daily life leaves less noise, and whether parish hunts pressed them back or merely taught them new hours. At your threshold, you tap the staff once on the step and once on the sill, the house's way of being greeted. Kitchen warmth pushes against your shins like a polite animal. You think of the far hills and their lean conversations, then of the pot and its domestic arithmetic. You choose arithmetic. Rope coils. Staff finds its peg. The night keeps its 2 voices, and neither needs you to correct it. Before sleep, you visit the rescue gear, because prevention prefers darkness. The pole hangs where any hand can reach. You lower it, test the hemp loop with mittened fists, and knock ice crumbs from the binding. The coil beside it is flaked and paid out, then drawn in again so future haste will not fight memory. Knots are retied slowly bowline for the loop, 2 half hitches for the peg, so they will remember their manners under cold. You walk the bank with your staff and lay 3 short markers from landing to pull little arrows for frightened eyes. A pan of coals blushes beside the reed screen. You set the iron hook across it for thawing straps if needed. The ash stripe at the first 2 steps is renewed. A broom's crosshatch turns glare into sentence. You listen for brittle music. The river answers with its steady anvil tone. Mainstream historical fact. Winter crossings kept rescue poles, lines, and simple hooks near landings. Plain gear and practice knots saved neighbors more often than bravery did. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some swear the loop must be twisted thrice to confuse the river. Others set a carved peg by the pole, so the water will count the notch and forget the person. You carve nothing. You count your own breath and drill your own hands. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how formal such precautions were named wardens, parish rules, or whether village habit handled it without ink. Gear kept where sense dictated, and everyone knew. You finish by placing one plank flat at the lip just wide enough for knees, then chalk a tiny cross where dusk hides the seam. Not piety so much as punctuation. On your way in, you hang the pole so its shadow falls where a sleepy hand will notice at dawn. You sleep better when wood, rope, and modest foresight have done their part. Thaw writes its first small lies at the edge's slush that pretends to be new strength. A gray that looks like honesty from the doorway and rudeness up close. You answer with boards. 2 planks come from the shed, knotty but straight, and you carry them to the landing like wide wooden words you plan to place carefully. One goes across the first soft tongue at the bank. The feral tampers it into partnership with the snow. The other waits nearby, a spare sentence against the next surprise. You test the board knee, then wait. Then a deliberate step. The sound returns muffled but willing. You dust ash on and off its lip, so boots learn a habit. At the far bank you set another plank ready, angled toward the safer shade. Slush glowers and loses interest. Mainstream historical fact. Villagers laid planks or fascines at thawing edges so loads could pass the treacherous first yard, where ice fails earliest. River work became carpentry until the cold returned. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some score a cross on the board's nose so it will remember to be a bridge. Others drive a nail through the far end to give the river a tooth to bite instead of an ankle. You settle for a shallow notch your boot can feel in poor light. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether such edge work was anyone's duty in the 12th century reeve, ferryman on furlough, or simply the nearest sensible back, because records praise roads and ignore the modest heroism of a timely plank. You stand back and watch one neighbor step, then another. The board behaves like a quiet witness that refuses drama. You lay the spare where your eye expects tomorrow's trouble, then go home with the pleased fatigue that follows work. No one notices when it succeeds. A timber haul gathers itself without being announced. 3 houses have small needs. 1 track will do for all. You tie the ropes together your coil to Jans to Merricks, so the load learns to speak in a single sentence. Each man takes a place. 1 at the nose, 1 at the shoulder, 1 keeping the tail from inventing opinions. The staff asks along your morning markers. The anvil note approves. You lean, step, breathe, and let the sledges learn your pace. The bundle wants to crab at the healed crack. You answer with angle, a half step wider, and the quiet command of ash underfoot. No speeches, only grammar. The far bank arrives without ideas. You rest the load in the lee of the mat, and each of you unties his rope without inspecting who pulled harder. Mainstream historical fact. Winter loads timber, brush, barrels were often shared, with neighbors hitching lines and taking turns at the rope. The village ledger lived in memory and meals more than in coin. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some spit on the last knot, so the load will loosen like a polite guest. Others pass a crust along the rope and then eat it, claiming it teaches agreement. You choose neither. You cut wedges for the stack so gravity will keep the peace. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how such labor was accounted ale later, bread now, or nothing spoken, and whether lord's dues touched small winter halls between cottages. Paper trails are thin where help is ordinary. On the return you carry nothing but your rope, which suddenly weighs as much as any favor. The river hums, indifferent to your modest triumph. You nod to your own twigs and promise them fresh company tomorrow. Night presses its ear to the rafters. You count the day in small coins. A stack of alder, a jar of clear water, a burbot asleep under snow, 2 boards arguing successfully with thaw, grain, salt, onions accounted, rope, coiled, staff, faithful. You chalk a tiny dot at the doorpost, not a letter, only a memory mark, and warm your hands over the ordinary fire that does not need to be admired. You say a few words because mouths prefer not to go to sleep owing anything. Not grand words, only gratitude that the river kept its bargain and that your feet kept theirs. You nickname the day enough, which is praise. The feral rests by the door, pointing toward the ford out of habit. Mainstream historical fact. Households closed winter days with brief prayers, pater noster, a saint's name, or simple thanks. Counted stores, banked coals, and marked doors in seasons that like to keep tally. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some tuck a crust above the lintel, so hunger has to climb. Others lay the staff across the threshold, to trip mischief as it enters. You set the staff beside the wall, and trust the ash you scattered to guard the step. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue how much formal devotion touched peasant nights, this early Latin from priest, vernacular at bed versus quiet household habit that left no ink. The rafters remember more prayers than the charters do. You bank the fire, set the pot's lid so steam can write its sleepy line, and listen to the floor decide where it will creak. Outside, the river hums a muted note. Inside, the room answers with silence. That means welcome. You lie down inside that answer. Morning finds the bank softening a gray seam at the edges, a lace of dark where reed meets ice. You do not argue with it. You stand, listen, and let patience do the first work. The feral asks. The answer comes back thinner at the lip and honest in midstream. You add 2 new twigs near shore, and tip them backward in your code respect, and plant a straight one at the place that now demands questions. The plank bridges the first treachery. Ash tightens the approach into sense. You shorten the day's ambitions. No bragging loads, only errands that forgive delay. The trap under the hole keeps its quiet hour. The wheel turns slow but willing. The reed shelters wait like respectable old men on a bench. You write a smaller sentence across the water and promise to read it letter by letter. Mainstream historical fact. Freeze-thaw weeks asked for lighter traffic, renewed markers, and planks at the banks. River roads pinched first at shore and failed last at the shade. Quirky or fringe tidbit. Some lay a green twig on the board, to remind winter it is not finished. Others murmur a farewell to the ice each morning until it answers. You murmur nothing. You listen, then comply. Scholarly uncertainty. Historians still argue whether winters in the 12th century here softened early, or held hard longer. Chronicles remember fairs on ice and sudden floods. But ordinary days like this dissolve without witnesses. You end where prudence begins. Rope coiled, staff within reach, boards ready, markers honest, breath steady. The river hums its changing note, and you agree to change with it. Work continues, smaller and safer, until cold returns or thaw takes the road back. You nod to both futures and step down with care. The room holds its breath and then releases it slowly, the way coals ease from orange to comfortable dark. You let your shoulders soften until they belong to you again. In the corner, rope rests in a proper coil, a tame circle that remembers fields and ponds and the long backward walk of its maker. The staff leans by the door with its shy iron foot, patient as a dog that knows it will be wanted at first light. On the sill, frost writes quiet letters and does not demand they be read. You stand within these small obediences and feel the day loosen thread by thread. Outside, the river keeps its low, even vowel under the lid, a sound like a big animal sleeping on its side. The willow markers along the ford hold their peeled tongues toward the moon, pale as fish bellies, faint as a promise kept. Straw mats murmur in the smallest wind, a whisper the ear mistakes for kindness. The plank at the bank lies where you left it, a short, wooden word that means continue but carefully. You close your eyes and can walk the line without moving ash. Twig, curve, straight. The little dip where the mill race worries, and then forgets to. The house lowers itself around you. Wool finds your wrists. The bowl on the shelf holds the ghost of steam. In your mind, the breathing hole wears its reed fringe and looks after itself through the night, patient and black, a mouth that does not bite. The trap waits below, basket listening to slow water. Far off, the wheel turns just enough to remember how. Closer, the floor chooses one board to speak for the others, and then decides not to. You lie down as if stepping from bank to ice, careful and certain. Breath lengthens. Weight spreads. The river's hum becomes the room's hum, and the room's hum becomes yours. The day's neatness continues without you. Ash holds, twigs tell the truth, Boards keep their place, rope stays coiled, sleep comes the way. Winter comes quietly, thoroughly, without asking for praise. We hope this quiet step into another time has left you feeling rested. If you've enjoyed it, you're welcome to like, share, or leave a gentle note. And if you'd like more slow walks through history, you can subscribe and join us again. End of script. Sweet dreams.